Imagine you get into the nursing program of your dreams. You're doing one of your final clinical rotations at a prestigious hospital you hope to work at someday after graduation. This was what was going on in Michelle Lay's life before a camera in a parking garage catches the last glimpse of her that anyone would ever see. This is her story. Let me introduce you to the beautiful, intelligent, hardworking Vietnamese-American nursing student Michelle Lay. She was born in San Diego, California on October 3, 1984, and about 3 years later, her brother Michael was born. Michelle's mom and her father, Son Lay, were immigrants from Vietnam. Their families migrated to California in the 70s when they were forced to flee Vietnam after the war. Their journey was not an easy one. To get to this country, they traveled in an open boat on the South China Sea and spent months in refugee camps until they finally arrived in San Diego, a place that they would learn to call home but were completely unfamiliar with. They didn't speak the language or know anyone, but they persevered, and after time, they truly embraced the American culture. There were doctors, lawyers, and other business professionals in Michelle's extended family. And by the time her mother and father got together, they had fully accepted the American culture. But that didn't mean they divorced themselves from their roots, not at all. Though they celebrated American holidays and called the United States home, they still held on to their Vietnamese traditions. Family was the most important, and as a matter of fact, it was common for many of the relatives to share one household. This meant that at any time, there could be 15 children under one roof. And that felt right to the Lays. They loved being surrounded by those who loved them. Michelle's mother was an extraordinary woman. She was a true role model. She worked as a nurse practitioner, and she would be gone all day long taking care of other people. And yet, she still had time to devote to her 2 children. One of Michelle and Michael's favorite pastimes was when their mom would read to them at night. They had a favorite story. It was called The Woman on the Moon. Michelle's mom used to have the children look up at the moon at night, and she would say, "If you look closely, the shadows covering the moon's surface resemble a woman with long, dark hair." The story of The Woman on the Moon was a Vietnamese love story. It was about a woman trapped on the moon, looking down on Earth for the man that she loved. Folklore and fairy tales are a part of many of our childhoods, and a lot of the time they are used to make sense of things that we don't understand. Some teach us lessons, and others provide comfort in times of sorrow. The Lay children had a real-life superhero living in their home, though, their super mom. She did it all with a smile on her face. She was kind, generous, and hardworking, and she and her husband made sure that their children never had to go without anything the way that they sometimes had growing up. Michelle was the oldest of 15 cousins, and she followed in her mom's footsteps. She was always taking care of her younger relatives, especially her brother. She was like a second mom to him. Michelle grew up in the Rancho Peñasquitos neighborhood in San Diego. It's called PQ to those who live there. This is the suburbs, lots of parks, families with children, coffee shops, young professionals, and highly rated public schools. Here it is on the map. The homes are very cookie-cutter. It's highly populated and considered a very safe place to live. They had a comfortable life. The Lays would take vacations with their extended family and have weekly get-togethers for dinner and other events. They were a very large, close-knit Vietnamese family. They would do anything for one another. And Son Lay's side of the family was about to step up in a major way. Back in 1994, Michelle's mom was keeping a secret. Michelle and Michael were about 10 and 7 years old when their mom found out that she had breast cancer. But she didn't want her battle to be her children's battle. She knew that, if they found out, it would cause them fear, anxiety, and sadness. So instead, she kept her diagnosis to herself and suffered in silence. She wanted her children to grow up strong, and she believed that it would affect them way too much to care for a dying mother. So, she never let the truth be known. Just 5 years later, in 1999, the family gathered for Thanksgiving dinner, and everyone was in attendance. They had a wonderful time, and Michelle's mom acted as usual. But that would be the last time they saw her alive. Just days after, on December 1st, 1999, Michelle and Michael, received the devastating news that their mother had succumbed to her cancer, a disease that they never knew she was battling. It came as a huge shock to everyone in their family. To think that she fought that battle all alone, selflessly sacrificing her own emotions to safeguard her children, made it even more difficult for them to cope with her death. They had not been given any chance to prepare for it. It was tough on everyone, especially Michelle, who was only 14. She had to step up even more as a mother figure to her 11-year-old brother. Sunlay moved his family in with his sister, and her house was about 15 minutes away in Mira Mesa, which is very similar to PQ. Michelle's aunt had kids of her own around Michelle and Michael's age, and one of them was Christine Dean. She was just 3 years younger than Michelle. It was as though they inherited a new set of brothers and sisters after losing their mother. That did help with the grief, but it did not take it away. At least they could share their sorrow with someone else and become stronger for it. Michael wasn't taking their mother's death well. Michelle found him holding on to something of their mother's and crying alone. This was his way of finding comfort and a connection after she passed. He was clinging to a piece of her and the memories that they had shared. At that moment, Michelle knew that she needed to step up, overcome her sense of loss, and be there for her brother. Soon, Michelle became more of a mother than a sister to Michael. This helped Michelle cope. She wanted to be brave and to honor her mother. Over time, Michelle and her cousin Christine also formed a special bond. They grew closer and closer throughout their teens. Michelle was especially grateful to Christine because that was the friendship she needed during one of the hardest times she was going through after her mother's death. Michelle was there to be a big sister to Christine. She was there to guide her in all things related to being a young woman, especially when it came to boys. Michelle actually helped Christine write her first love letter. She went with her to the mall to purchase her first bra. She taught her how to tweeze her eyebrows, put on makeup, and straighten her hair. Michelle's cousins looked up to her, and Christine wanted to be just like her. They even looked alike, and people would call Christine a mini Michelle. By the time she was in high school, Michelle attended Mount Carmel High School, which was about 10 minutes away from where they lived. Her motherly instincts extended beyond caring for her own family, because Michelle took children under her wing all the time. She was popular at Mount Carmel. She used to hang out with the cool kids, and she always had boys chasing her. They were always trying to get her attention, but she was humble. It's like she didn't really know how beautiful she really was. An example of this was one afternoon when Michelle saw a little girl named Jazelle Esteban. She was sitting all alone at the lunchroom table. Michelle went over there, introduced herself, and asked the girl if she wanted to have lunch with her. They hit it off, and over time they became best friends. That's just how Michelle was. Jazelle was quiet and reserved, but Michelle was very outgoing, and that helped her come out of her shell. She was generous and kind. She would spend time with Jazelle doing normal teenage stuff, like going to the movies, going out to eat, and many times they would have each other over at their homes for family dinners. Michelle treated everyone like family and welcomed Jazelle with open arms. You actually never know who you may connect with if you don't give someone a chance, and Michelle was all about opening herself up to people. She had a lot of friends, but she and Jazelle had so much in common that they became so close. Jazelle was from a Filipino-American family of immigrants. She also grew up in San Diego, and just like Michelle, she was born in 1984 to a very close-knit family who worked really hard to make ends meet. She also had many professionals in her extended family, and she was brought up with the same work ethic as Michelle. Both of these young women had so much ambition. Michelle wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps and honor her memory by becoming a nurse, and soon Jazelle decided she wanted to go down the very same path. So after they graduated high school in 2002, they both applied to college to get their prerequisites out of the way before they could apply to nursing schools. The pair decided that they should move to San Francisco to study because it would be so much fun. It would be a change of scenery, they could be very independent, and there were a lot more opportunities in a big city. Initially, Michelle got into San Jose State University, and Jazelle landed a spot at San Francisco State University. Michelle planned to transfer to San Francisco State to be closer to Jazelle, but for now, they were about an hour apart. School came first, so they focused on their studies while they kept in touch until they reunited. And that came the very next semester, spring of 2003. Michelle transferred into San Fran State, so now the two best friends were spending time together once again and making new friends. One of those friends was a guy named Scott Marosigan. He was a fellow student who was already a part of Jazelle's friend group and was introduced to Michelle when she started attending San Fran State. While Michelle and Scott hit it off right away, it turned out they didn't quite match when it came to anything romantic in nature, and they decided they were better as friends. They did kind of see each other for a month, but Michelle had already set her sights on someone else at the time, so nothing ever came of it. However, they got along great, so they still remained in the same social group with Jazelle and their other friends. Eventually, by the fall of that year, 2003, Jazelle and Scott were spending a lot more time together. Unlike Scott and Michelle, which fizzled out, Jazelle and Scott were hot and heavy. So of course Michelle, being a mutual friend of Scott and Jazelle, definitely approved of the romance, even though she had, of course, briefly considered Scott for a partner herself. They were never physical with each other, and they got along great, so Michelle was super happy for her bestie. But the three of them spent a lot of time together. Michelle always had guys around so she could go on double dates with a couple, and they just had so much fun. But, as most of us know, when we have big changes in our lives and dating someone exclusively can be one of those changes, our paths can go in different directions than our friends, no matter how close we are. And that's what happened to Michelle and Jazelle. It's completely normal. Jazelle had found the one. She was spending way more time with Scott and less time with Michelle. And that was okay with Michelle because she was working hard to get her prerequisites in order to apply to nursing school. So the years went on, and by the spring of 2005, Jazelle had some big news. She was pregnant. She and Scott were going to have a daughter together, and Michelle was so happy for Jazelle. But their lives really were going in two totally different directions. Jazelle had decided to put a pause on college in order to focus on her family, and Michelle was putting in hours at both work and school to reach her goals. By late October of that year, Jazelle gave birth to her daughter, Isabel, and she decided to work at a daycare center to provide for her growing family. At this point, Michelle had just landed a job at Turner Construction as an accounting clerk, and she too was in a serious relationship with her boyfriend Tommy. Life was progressing, and friends were becoming more distant. I know this all too well, but at least there's social media, where we can look in on the lives of our loved ones and the people we care about the most. We can check in from time to time and catch up on their lives. And that's what Michelle and Jazelle were left doing, because their lives changed so fast and frequently. Years went on, and by August of 2010, Michelle had gotten accepted into Samuel Merritt University's accelerated nursing program. This was a grueling, intensive, short-term program where students earn a Bachelor of Science in Nursing in just 12 months instead of 2 years. Getting into the school is not easy. First, you have to have a bachelor's degree with a good GPA, score high on the entrance exams, have great recommendations, and they only accept about 300 students every year, even though hundreds apply. Michelle was very proud of her accomplishment, so one of the first people she told the news to was her high school bestie, Jazelle. As they were catching up, Jazelle had news of her own. By then, she and Scott had gone their separate ways, and they were trying their best to co-parent little 5-year-old Isabel. Jazelle told Michelle that now that she was sharing custody of Isabel, she was finally ready to get serious about studying and also about hanging out with Michelle more, kind of rekindle their friendship. Michelle was always there for her friends, so of course she told Jazelle, "If you need anything, let me know." But that year was going to be a lot for Michelle, and even though she had good intentions, any spare time she had to use for work or to study. Her new school was in Oakland, and it was across the bay from San Francisco. Michelle was living about 40 minutes away in San Mateo, and it was an exciting time for her. She was living her dream, and her brother was not too far behind because he decided that he also wanted to work in the medical field. So at the time, he was an EMT and was studying for a psychology degree at the University of California, Berkeley, which was only about 20 minutes away from where Michelle was going to school. So finally someone in her family was close by, because everyone else was still 8 hours away in San Diego. But Michelle had always kept in touch, especially with Christine, who was actually set to move in with Michelle by the summer of 2011. At that point, Michelle would have graduated from Samuel Merritt and be working as a nurse at a nearby hospital. That was the plan anyway. Over the years, Michelle still made it a point to spend as much time with her family and close friends as she could. As they all grew up and went in their separate directions, she would do holidays and special events, and that would always bring them together. But for the next year, Michelle had to get really serious. This program that she was in was very fast-paced. After she completed her workload on campus, she had to complete rotations at a hospital nearby called Kaiser Permanente, where they offered a work-study program. So you get paid as you learn and go through all these different clinical departments. One could be mental health, another could be emergency surgery, until you were able to complete all departments in your program. Kaiser is a very well-respected hospital. It's a dream for many nursing students to work there one day. And by May of 2011, Michelle was 26 years old. She was working in the labor and delivery rotation in the maternity ward at Kaiser. Memorial Day was coming up from Saturday, May 28th through Monday, May 30th, and the last day of those rotations was Friday, the 27th. So she planned to drive to Reno and meet up with some friends after she completed her final shift at around 10 p.m. She was under a lot of pressure in the weeks leading up to this day. She had her final evaluation that night, and her last one with her instructor, Lori Rosa, hadn't gone perfectly. She was informed that there were a few things Michelle needed to work on to pass with an A, which was what she strived for. Michelle was a straight A student. She took this program very seriously, and she was anxious about the end of the session. She wanted to make sure that everything went smoothly. Instructor Rosa paired each student with a hospital nurse who worked in either the labor and delivery or the maternity unit, and then they monitored the progress of the student throughout their shift. It was an all-day shift with a couple of breaks throughout the day. On one of those breaks, right before 7 p.m., Michelle told one of the Kaiser nurses who worked in the maternity unit that she was going to quickly step out and go to her car, which was in an attached parking garage because she needed to grab some medication that she had to take. Michelle made her way to the parking garage to do so. She had to walk through a pedestrian bridge that connected the hospital to the parking structure. Shortly after 7 p.m., a hospital security guard notified Instructor Rosa that Michelle had not signed out at the end of her shift in the maternity ward. So Rosa searched the ward. She sent Michelle a text and also left a voicemail, but she wasn't able to contact her. A couple of hours later, just before 9 p.m., the handful of nursing students were wrapping up their final shift, and Instructor Rosa was calling them together for their evaluations. That's when she noticed Michelle still wasn't in attendance, and that was not like her. She asked the students if they knew where she was, and after a few minutes, they determined that the last time anyone saw Michelle was at that 7 p.m. break, when she said she needed to go get her medication in her car. This concerned Instructor Rosa. Was Michelle okay? Did she have some kind of medical emergency? What was going on? The students all parked on the third floor of the parking garage, so Instructor Rosa thought it would be a good idea to go check to see if Michelle's car was parked in the spot they had last seen it in earlier that day. She did call a security guard to go with her, just in case they were to find Michelle in need of assistance. When someone says that they're taking medication, a red flag definitely goes up, especially for a nursing instructor, and she didn't know what to expect. She wanted to be prepared. However, as they made their way to Michelle's parking spot, her brand new white 2010 Honda CR-V wasn't there. The instructor and the security guard decided They were going to walk up and down the rows of cars just to make sure that Michelle hadn't moved her car. And all of a sudden, Instructor Rosa saw it, the white CRV, and it was making its way back up the ramp towards the spot that Michelle had been parked in. What is going on? Why would Michelle leave without telling her instructor or telling anyone? Instructor Rosa began to flag her down, but just as she was able to catch a glimpse of the front of the vehicle, it literally stopped and began backing down the ramp. The instructor ran down the ramp on foot, trying to catch up with her, and she saw Michelle's car almost hit another student's vehicle. Then it started zigzagging across the parking garage and speeding away. That is really odd. It didn't make sense. Where was Michelle going, and was she trying to deliberately avoid her instructor? She wasn't in trouble. It was okay if she needed to leave, but it just wasn't like her not to be transparent about her plans. The instructor didn't know what to think at this point. Could Michelle be experiencing a medical condition? Was she not thinking correctly? Did she need help? She called Michelle's phone several times and left a few voice messages, but Michelle never responded. After talking to the students, they all agreed that this was very out of character for Michelle. They were all calling her now. They were all texting her, including a guy that she was supposedly seeing, who was in the program with her, and no one heard back. Instructor Rosa was so concerned with this behavior, she called the Hayward Police Department, and by 10 p.m., she reported Michelle missing or in distress. She wasn't sure, she just felt like something was wrong. However, this wasn't the highest priority because, after all, Michelle was an adult. She could come and go as she pleased, and although it was maybe against the rules for her to skip out on her rotation, it wasn't illegal for her to decide to leave class. No one saw anything that would suggest Michelle was hurt, but the police department still sent out an officer to speak with Instructor Rosa. All the students provided information about Michelle to the officer. They said that she was punctual, responsible, and that she didn't mention anything about leaving early. However, some did say that she mentioned going on a trip following that night's session, so they gave the officer the name of the friend she was supposed to be meeting with. They didn't have much to go on at this point. It was concerning. Michelle had worked really hard to get where she was. She had invested a lot of time, energy, and money into her nursing education, so it did shock her classmates to think that she would just leave, especially when she was at the finish line. She needed this rotation to graduate, but maybe she was under so much stress. Even then, she would let her instructor know. They believed something had to have happened, because just leaving in the middle of a clinical, essential for graduation, was highly unlikely. There just had to be a reason. The officer asked Instructor Rosa what Michelle looked like when she was racing away in the garage. Did she appear scared or in distress? But the instructor said, "I didn't actually see her. I just knew it was her car because I was familiar with it." The officer was escorted to the parking garage, which was about a 10-minute walk from the hospital. They went through the footbridge and to the third floor. He took note of the parking spot, as well as the times that the instructor and the classmates said they saw Michelle last, including the time her car was seen speeding away. Now Michelle's purse and her keys were left behind in a break room. All she took with her was her cell phone. So this truly did look as though she intended to come right back. So what happened? Could she have gotten a call? Maybe there was a family emergency, and she left right away, not caring about leaving her things behind, thinking, you know what, they're safe and I'll just explain later. Or did something happen? Did she get sick? She was on medication, so perhaps she drove home, came back, only to realize, you know what, I can't stay in class, I'm too ill. There were so many questions, but not much the officer could do. They did take down all the information about Michelle, her vehicle make and model, as well as contact information for all of her classmates and friends. They planned to wait and see if she would show up the next day. The next day came. It was Saturday, and all night, Michelle's friends had been texting her, trying to piece together her whereabouts. They were texting each other, and by the morning her ex-boyfriend Tommy texted Michelle's closest cousin, Christine. He said, "We cannot find Michelle." Well, Christine did know Michelle very well. They grew up together, and Michelle was known to be someone who worked hard, but also played hard. It was a holiday weekend, so Christine knew Michelle had been under a lot of stress, and she just figured, you know what, she went out really late the night before, and maybe she spent the night out with friends. She didn't think much of it. She just looked at the text and thought, okay, what did Michelle get herself into now? Then she turned over and went back to sleep. However, a few hours later, after texting and calling Michelle several times without getting an answer, Christine began to get worried. Meanwhile, Michelle's brother Michael had gotten the same text from Tommy that no one could find Michelle. Michael knew Michelle and Tommy had recently broken up. He really wasn't sure what his sister's intentions were with Tommy at that point, and he didn't want to get involved in any drama, so he simply ignored the message. However, something was nagging at the back of Michael's mind, so he logged on to Facebook to see what Michelle had been doing. When he scrolled through his sister's feed, he saw that Michelle had some friends in town who planned on visiting Reno that day. Michael texted one of Michelle's friends who was joining her on that trip to find out where his sister was. After sending the message, Michael left his house for work and started his day. It wasn't until later that day, when Michelle's nursing instructor called him, that it really hit him that Michelle could be in danger. Unbeknownst to Christine and Michael, Michelle's closest friends had gathered earlier that day at the Hayward Police Department as soon as it opened, before Inspector Frazier Ritchie even had a chance to get there, because he had just been assigned this case. Once he got there, he ushered them into a conference room to gather information about what they knew. He was also briefed by the officer from the night before, who had gone out to Kaiser. It had been at least 12 hours since anyone had seen Michelle. Because of how concerned her loved ones were, with some actually beginning to drive the 8 hours from San Diego, Inspector Ritchie really wanted to figure out what was going on. He interviewed the friends who had come to the station to offer up any information they had, and they all said the same thing. Michelle was so organized. She had a plan A, B, C, D, and the list goes on. But what they did say was that it was possible she could have been under a lot of stress and could have taken off just to get away from it all. Though possible, it just didn't seem to be her style. Inspector Ritchie left to follow up on some of that information, and her family was just in this conference room for hours, wondering what happened. Did they find her? Were there any leads? But the police wouldn't give them any information. However, they would ask a bunch of questions like, what kind of car did she have? But why? And then it was just silence. It's tough because in order to do a thorough investigation, the police have to withhold information. That's just part of the process. With the information provided by Michelle's friends and family, Inspector Ritchie was able to determine that Michelle's new CR-V had LoJack on it. It's an anti-theft device that's installed on newer vehicles to track their location. It didn't take long for them to get a hit. A townhouse community on Ponderosa Court, about half a mile away from Kaiser, a mere 2-minute drive. Here's what it looked like in that area. Her car was parked in a guest spot in front of one of these townhouses, down a parking lot like this. When they got close to inspect it, they noticed it was locked, and there was nothing really wrong with it. It wasn't parked weird, and there was no external damage. They could kind of look inside. The windows were very tinted, but from what they could see, there were just ordinary items on the back seat. A shopping bag, some opened Amazon packages, garbage, a Victoria's Secret catalog, a pair of shoes, and they saw a prescription bag, the kind you get from CVS or Rite Aid, that was lying on the back seat. So that must have been what Michelle went out to her car to retrieve. In the front, they could see a can of soda in the cup holder. But for the most part, the car was pretty clean. It was new. It didn't even have metal license plates yet. It still had the paper ones from the dealership. They had her car, but not a warrant to search it, so all they could do was gather info from what was on the outside. After looking underneath, they saw some fresh brush or grass hanging from the tailgate area, so this could mean that the car was taken off-road. And though the car did have that dark tint on it, they thought they could see something on the front passenger seat that looked like it could be a stain of some kind, but they couldn't be sure. But why was Michelle's car parked here? None of her friends lived in this complex. Did she drive there to talk to someone? Why? Well, when they interviewed one of the residents, they said they saw some headlights shine through their window around 4 a.m. and heard people having a conversation. It seemed like it was coming from the direction where Michelle's vehicle was, but they admitted they never looked outside, so they didn't know for sure. But it was 4 a.m., and Michelle's vehicle was last seen at 9 p.m. It was all too confusing. A tow truck came, and they moved Michelle's vehicle so a forensics team could analyze it and secure any evidence found inside. Inspector Ritchie searched this entire area where Michelle's vehicle was parked, but he did not find anything suspicious. No blood or evidence of a struggle. However, he was concerned about Michelle's belongings being left behind. Her purse, her wallet. They were at the medical center's break room. People don't just leave their belongings behind, so that was a red flag. If Michelle did leave to go meet someone here, why wouldn't she bring her things, especially if she wasn't planning on coming back? So Ritchie needed to go back to the hospital and gather more evidence. He noticed there were a lot of cameras in the parking garage, so he asked the security department to pull all the footage from May 27th. But there was an issue. Only the live feed could be viewed on site. The hospital had a contract with a third party, and the recorded footage was stored at an off-site location, so it was going to take hours to retrieve it. So now they had to wait. By now, Michael had heard back from Michelle's friends, who were supposed to travel with her the night before. They had planned to meet up at a coffee shop on Friday night after her shift, but she never showed up, and she never made it out to Reno. So Michael decided it was time to take a trip over to the hospital, where many of Michelle's friends had gathered and were already handing out missing persons flyers. They had Michelle's face on them, along with all of her information. She was 26, 5 feet 6 inches, with black hair and brown eyes, and she had a tattoo of her mother's name on her chest. She was wearing white scrubs and was last seen at 7 p.m. on Friday, May 27th at Kaiser Hospital. Then something unexpected happened. Around 12:45 p.m., all of her friends started getting texts from her. All their messages were being responded to, and they were able to breathe a sigh of relief. But what did the messages say? Well, one of the first ones said, "I'm not missing," and many of the other texts explained that Michelle's phone had been acting crazy. It had deleted everything. There were other messages that said, "You know what? All your texts just killed my battery," and additional responses letting her friends know that she was fine. "I'm just taking it easy," or "It's okay, I'm okay, I just needed a break." She messaged one person that she just needed some time without anyone. And one of her loved ones got a message saying Michelle had a really bad night the night before and didn't want to talk to anyone. Even Inspector Ritchie had called and texted Michelle. He made it clear that this was not a joke and that she needed to call him back immediately. She responded by text, saying that she was looking for a charger right now, and then her phone kept dropping calls. Her friends and family sent over 100 texts and phone calls in the 15 hours that she had been missing, and now all of them were being responded to. But then, by 2 p.m., the texts just stopped again. That was odd. What was even more concerning was that Michelle didn't make the effort to call her loved ones back. It was clear they were worried. By now, she was fully aware, or should have been, that they had called the police, driven 8 hours, passed out missing persons flyers, and found her car abandoned. But she failed to pick up the phone and talk to any of them. It made no sense. Inspector Ritchie heard all the concerns, and he had them too. The fact that she didn't call the police back after being informed that they were doing an investigation didn't add up. Not only that, her ex, Tommy, who she had dated for years, told Ritchie that he got a very unusual response from Michelle's number. She knew his number by heart, yet when she texted him back, she said, "Who is this? I don't have your number in my phone." Even if she had deleted his contact, she would still know his number, so that didn't make sense. At this point, all Michelle's friends and family members believed someone else was using Michelle's phone to contact them, and it frightened her brother. He felt like he was living in a nightmare, like this could not be happening. It was unreal. They truly believed someone took her from that hospital parking lot that night. That was the only thing that made sense now. But Richie wasn't so sure. He realized that all of this seemed out of character for Michelle. But what if she really just didn't want to talk to anyone? What if she told her ex that she didn't know who he was? Perhaps it was to give him a hint that she wasn't interested in speaking with him. True, it was odd that she didn't call back the police station, but again, if you were really trying to get away, leave town, and you weren't missing, would you really have a reason to call? It's not a crime to leave on your own volition. The security footage from the parking garage had just come back, though, and there were over 100 hours of video and 330 different camera angles. It was going to take a long time to comb through. So Richie decided to start with the last known sighting of Michelle, which was right before 7 p.m. Sure enough, as he's scrubbing through the footage, he spots Michelle briskly walking through that footbridge from the hospital to the parking garage, and nothing seems out of the ordinary. She's not being followed or chased. She just looks as though she's trying to be quick because she's got to be back within 15 minutes. Here she is on camera at 6:55 p.m., and then the next camera captures her walking in the direction of her vehicle, which would have been parked on the right side. It's out of frame, since her car is near a camera. There was one right on top of where she was parked. Richie wanted to see that vantage point. But unfortunately, I swear this happens in every one of these cases. It was a newly installed camera, and it wasn't set to record footage. So, though it would have captured everything, it wasn't working. And isn't it always that way? Who's in charge of these things? Because I swear it's always that one vital camera that's not working. But what they do capture is this. At 7:17 p.m., Michelle's car is leaving the parking garage. But why? The next thing Richie looks for is the instructor and the security guard. They arrive in the location around 8:56 p.m., and just like Lori Rose said, you can kind of see a white Honda CR-V come up that ramp at around 9:06 p.m. Now, what you can't see is Rosa waving it down because she's out of frame here. However, you can see how the car just stops and then backs up. In the following viewpoint, it's almost clipping that pole when it's racing out of the garage. Richie just had to see this for himself, but it leaves even more questions. What made Michelle leave class? Was it really her medication, or did she get a text from someone? Was she lured out to the parking lot? Was she kidnapped? He just didn't know. He wasn't any closer to understanding what happened between 7 and 9 p.m., and the video was too grainy for him to tell. If it was Michelle behind the wheel of the SUV, they were about to get a break in this case, the biggest one yet. The forensic team that was analyzing Michelle's vehicle found something in the front passenger seat. It was kind of halfway shoved under the seat. An ID. Not a license, but a clip-on badge from Samuel Merritt Nursing School. It wasn't Michelle's. It had a picture and a name of another woman, Elaine San Augustine, BSN RN, adjunct assistant instructor. Who was this woman, and why was her badge in Michelle's car? Richie calls up instructor Rosa to ask for information about this person, but that name was not familiar to her. So it was time to call around to figure out who this person was. Maybe they knew where Michelle had gone, or worse, maybe it was her who was involved in Michelle's disappearance. But there was more. It wasn't looking like Michelle had merely gone missing. There was evidence that led investigators to believe that Michelle was probably dead. This would come as a shock to her family, especially since the investigators had to keep all of the evidence close to their vest and under seal. But there were suspected bloodstains all around inside Michelle's car, as well as between the door frame and the floor runner. First, there was a kind of lighter stain on the front passenger side, on the seat. But then, look at the passenger side door. There was blood in the door frame area, and not a little bit either. It was in the back seat, on the back passenger side floor mat. It was very obvious that blood had to be actively dripping from a wound onto the back seat passenger side floorboard. Investigators believed this was where Michelle had been placed after she was attacked, and the amount of blood it would take to leave these stains behind meant that Michelle was most likely unable to survive this attack. If this was indeed Michelle's blood, it still needed to be tested for DNA, but it wasn't looking good. They also pulled fingerprints from around inside the vehicle, gathered hairs, and tested various surfaces for DNA. All along, Michelle's family was holding out hope that she was still alive, missing, but alive. There were nights when Christine would shiver and think to herself, I really hope Michelle is wearing a jacket and that she's warm, because she didn't want to think about her cousin, whom she loved like a sister, being out there alone in the cold. Samuel Merritt got back to Inspector Ritchie about the woman whose ID they had found in Michelle's car. She was a brand new instructor. She hadn't even started working at the school yet, and she was supposed to be out of state in Hawaii on vacation. But was she, or was there more to that story? As Ritchie knew, he needed to find out where this woman was and talk to her. But in the meanwhile, he also compiled a list of Michelle's closest friends and family members, and had been interviewing each of them to gather as much information as he could. Everyone had positive things to say about Michelle, how responsible she was, how you could always count on her, how kind and caring she was, and how she had her friends' backs, except one friend, an old friend who knew Michelle better than most. Remember Jazelle? While she was one of the people on the list Ritchie needed to speak with, he had been told that Jazelle was one of Michelle's closest and oldest friends, but they weren't close as of late. As he had done with the previous friends, he paid Jazelle a visit at her apartment in Union City, which was about a 25-minute drive from where Michelle lived, and only a 10-minute drive from Kaiser. Inspector Ritchie knocked, and when Jazelle came to the door, he introduced himself and explained that they were there about a concern regarding Michelle Lay. When Jazelle heard the name, she was kind of like, "Who?" She seemed a little annoyed, almost as if she was thinking, what is it this time?" That kind of response. Ritchie explained that Michelle had gone missing, and Jazelle's attitude was sort of dry. There just didn't seem to be a lot of worry in her voice. She was just very matter-of-fact, saying, "Okay, well, have you tried calling her, texting her, reaching out to her friends?" Ritchie said, "Well, yeah, that's why we're here. We heard that the two of you had known each other a long time, but that you had somewhat of a falling out a few years back." This was information that they had gathered from a few of the meetings with other recent friends of Michelle's. One person had actually described Jazelle and Michelle's relationship as tumultuous, which was the word that Inspector Ritchie used. He asked Jazelle if it was true, and she laughed. She seemed almost to question why he used that word, as though it was a bit more dramatic than what the status of their relationship really was. However, remember I said all of Michelle's friends, except Jazelle, had positive things to say about her? Well, maybe people who know us the longest have seen us through many different life experiences, and maybe they have a different point of view than acquaintances and classmates. Because, as Jazelle explained, Michelle wasn't the perfect person that everyone claims she was. Ritchie was all ears. He needed to know every point of view, even the less favorable ones. It's part of victimology, understanding the victim's personality, mentality, and position in life that could have gotten them hurt or in danger. So Jazelle explained they were very close until Michelle's true colors shone through. She was a liar, and she betrayed her. She said that they were best friends, but her then BFF slept with her fiancé. There was a lot to dig into, so Ritchie asked Jazelle to come down to the station to make a formal report, so they could have all of this information on the record. Jazelle agreed. Once in the interview room, she explained that Michelle had dated Scott before he and Jazelle became a thing. Once she got serious with Scott, she wasn't as comfortable with Michelle hanging around him, especially since they seemed to be flirting with one another, and they had a past. Even though it had only been a month that they were kind of together casually, it didn't matter. The time came when Jazelle found out that Michelle had been keeping a secret from her, and as her best friend, that seemed really messed up. It hurt Jazelle, and it involved the man she loved. Apparently, according to Jazelle, back in the fall of 2003, when the three of them used to hang out regularly, and Jazelle had just gotten into a serious relationship with Scott, Michelle confided in him, and only him, that she was pregnant but planned to have an abortion. Michelle insisted that Scott keep this information to himself and not tell Jazelle. Well, a few weeks later, Jazelle finds out about Michelle's secret and that Scott had already known. Jazelle didn't just feel betrayed because two of the people she trusted the most had been lying to her. She honestly felt like there was more to their secret keeping. She believed they had gotten too close and slept together behind her back. Why else, in her mind, would Michelle reach out to him to tell him that she's pregnant and getting an abortion? That's the only thing that made sense to Jazelle. But both Scott and Michelle denied ever having been in a sexual relationship before Jazelle and Scott were dating, or at any other time. It didn't matter how much they denied it. Jazelle was furious. She just would not accept any other reason why they would have kept this a secret from her. So things became rocky between her and Michelle. She still wanted badly to be close to her, but she just had a hard time trusting her friend after that. However, by 2005, she and Scott had broken up anyway, so she did keep in touch with Michelle here and there. She wasn't completely out of her life. Michelle tried hard to make things right. She would reassure Jazelle that nothing ever happened. Michelle still hung out in Jazelle and Scott's friend group, and despite Jazelle's wishes, Scott was still nice to Michelle and considered her a friend. A few months after they split up, Scott and Jazelle ended up getting back together. That was the summer of 2005, when Jazelle found out she was pregnant. So she and Scott tried to do the right thing and made things work between them for the baby. Isabel was born on October 31st of that year, and things seemed to be okay for a while. Until about a year after the baby was born, all of a sudden, Jazelle sensed that Michelle and Scott were talking again. He reassured her they were merely platonic, but at this point, Jazelle had had enough. She told Scott he was either her or Michelle. Scott agreed to stop talking to Michelle or being friends with her to keep things positive between him and the mother of his child. They dated and lived together for 3 years, but things ended up falling apart, and they broke up in the summer of 2008. I told you that it was at this point when Jazelle kind of tried to reconcile with Michelle. She talked about getting her life back in order. She didn't have full custody of Isabel anymore, and she was trying to co-parent with Scott. Well, there was a little more to that story. Their co-parenting turned into high-conflict parenting, and by August of 2010, they were at a therapy appointment. The topic of Michelle came up. Jazelle explained that she still had this hostility and trust issues with Scott because of her belief that he and Michelle had been more than friends and had slept together. Not only that, ever since they had broken up, Jazelle said that Scott was hanging out with Michelle and even going on dates with her recently. The therapist asked Jazelle what would make her feel better, and they came to the conclusion that Michelle should come into one of these sessions with Scott and Jazelle so they could talk it out. Michelle, being who she was and trying to be there for her friends, agreed it wasn't easy. They hashed it out together. There were a lot of tears, a lot of anger, but in the end, it seemed like everyone was in a good headspace. Jazelle explained this to the investigator, but her words were a little harsh. She said that Scott made a mistake and Michelle made a mistake. They made a mistake together, and her best friend slept with her fiancé. So she still believed it regardless of how things seemed to have worked out in that therapy session just about a year ago. So, what does this all mean? One thing, Michelle may not be perfect, but nobody said she was. It also showed that Jazelle definitely held a grudge. But what did any of this have to do with Michelle's disappearance? Richie wasn't sure, but Jazelle expressed that she was very tired and it was hard for her to concentrate because she had fatigue from being pregnant. Yes, Jazelle was 3 months pregnant, and investigators had had her there for hours. They felt like she had given them enough information, and now she could go home. But what Richie really wanted to know was more about this Scott person. Although a lot of this did sound like high school drama, or as they say, baby mama drama, he still had to look into everything. They had already preliminarily interviewed Scott when they were going down Michelle's list of friends. He mentioned some of the same things: the brief connection with Michelle, the relationship with Jazelle, the friendship between him and Michelle bothering his ex, that he considered Michelle a dear friend, and he seemed genuinely concerned by Michelle's sudden disappearance. He explained that the last time he heard from Michelle was on the morning of May 28th, the day after she went missing. During the time that everyone was texting her, asking where she was, Scott had sent a text asking what she was doing that day. He didn't know she was missing. He was just having a normal conversation with her. Scott received a reply that Michelle was on her way to Reno and she was putting out fires because people thought she was missing. Scott texted back because he wanted clarification, but he never received a response. Richie thought they had to take a deeper look. By now, many of Michelle's family members had come from out of town, so they pitched in for hotel rooms. They were going from place to place, putting up flyers and hopping from hotel to hotel as they waited for answers. Since the Hayward Police Department hadn't told Michelle's family anything about the investigation, they were unaware of the developments. The details investigators uncovered concerning Michelle's disappearance were completely unknown to her family. But there were developments indeed. For one, the DNA taken from the swabs collected from Michelle's car came back positive as Michelle's blood. And though her body had not been found, the police had found blood, not only in Michelle's car but from day one, in the parking spot where Michelle's car had been before she went missing. That's right, a fact that none of you knew about until now. On the floor of that parking garage where the passenger side door would have been, there was a smear of blood. It looked as if someone had tried to actually wipe it up, and it was confirmed to be Michelle's. Yet the family had no idea, and they felt detached from the entire investigation. They weren't even informed that the investigation had gone from a missing person to a homicide. They had to find that out from watching the news, and it really upset them. They felt like they were in the dark about everything. This was their loved one, yet the police couldn't give them the reasons why they felt she was no longer alive. Yet both Michael and Christine believed that they could still feel Michelle's presence, and unless the police could give them concrete proof that she was dead, they were going to continue to fight to find their lost sister and cousin, no matter what. They weren't giving up hope, because that's what they knew Michelle would do for them. When the police had the DNA confirmation, they did call Michelle's family to come down to the station for a meeting. It was then that they were officially informed that Michelle's case was now a homicide, yet they still did not reveal the reasons why. As I said, Michelle's family did not take this well. They didn't like the way they were being treated. They just wanted to know why. Why do you believe Michelle is dead? But all they got was silence. One officer even had the audacity to say to Michelle's brother, "You have to get comfortable with the fact that your sister is probably dead." But they couldn't let themselves believe it. It didn't seem real. On June 9th, a candlelight vigil was held at the parking lot where Michelle's car had been found. That was the last place that had a connection to Michelle, so a large number of Michelle's friends and family, even ones that came all the way from Vietnam, were there, as well as strangers who had never met Michelle. They were from the community. They heard about her story and they wanted to come out to support the family. News stations were there because Michelle's friends were diligent in keeping her name in the media. They were constantly making sure that no one forgot about Michelle. They made t-shirts from her missing persons flyers. Her face and all of her information were on it. They even put up a website, michellelaymissing.com, and that website became a hub. All the information was there, and it provided a place to support the Lay family because they needed it. It provided a central platform to share updates, organize volunteer search parties, and accept donations to support the case. They also set up a Facebook page that gave information about everything, daily tips that came in, where they could pass out flyers, and what events were coming up to support their search efforts. It showed all of the places that flyers had already been distributed, and it helped to organize where to go next. They wanted to make sure they were covering all areas so that they could get flyers into the hands of as many people as possible. And because they had Facebook and this group of people from all over the world, they were putting up flyers everywhere, from Brazil to Iceland. Just look, this location says Claremont, and then it shows where the flyers were, Ranch 99, Yogurt World, Morning Glory, things like that. They were so organized. So, Back to the vigil. So many people spoke, including Christine and Michael and Michelle's father. He criticized the Hayward Police Department. He stated that they were withholding information, and until they had actual proof that Michelle was dead, until they saw a body, they wouldn't believe it for a minute. In order to locate Michelle, her family offered a reward. It was up to $65,000. $45,000 of that was donated by Michelle's place of employment, Turner Construction. She worked there for 5 years, and the rest came from various places, most of it from Michelle's family. They put up a huge billboard on the side of the highway. Her family hoped she was alive. They missed her. They wanted her to come home. They pleaded for help in front of the news cameras. Christine started to think that maybe this had to do with human trafficking. It was at that time they knew they had to go even further in their search for Michelle. Investigators scanned the crowd of the vigil for anyone that seemed suspicious or out of place. They do this a lot in these investigations, just to see if they could follow a new lead. And sure enough, they spotted someone that they had just looked up a few days before, Scott, Jazelle's ex. This definitely wasn't the time to take him away and bring him into the station, but they waited and they watched his demeanor. But like many other people, he seemed distraught, upset, and sad over Michelle being missing. But was he? Or could he have a reason to want her to be gone? He was still on the list as someone that they needed to speak to. At this point, though, the family hired a private investigator to work on the case. After looking over all the facts, this private investigator informed the family that they believed that there had to be 2 people involved in Michelle's disappearance, and at least one of them must have known her pretty well. The reason being, whoever took Michelle's vehicle after she disappeared knew where she was parked, her schedule, and where she would be. His belief about why there were 2 people was because they had to have gotten Michelle into her car easily and quickly. So this private investigator asked the public to come forward with tips, and he would make sure that those would get to the right people. And tips did come in. One seemed promising. It was from an inmate, and he said that Michelle was being held captive in a house in Hayward. This sent them on a wild goose chase because it turned out not to be connected to this case at all. And that must be frustrating because you feel this sense of relief, but it's snuffed out right away. There was another detective looking into Michelle's case. He was from a different city in Northern California, where he was investigating the disappearance and murder of another similar victim named Fong Lei. They even had the same last name, and get this, they were around the same age. Fong was just days away from turning 25 before she went missing, and she had recently graduated from a nursing program. She vanished outside a Barnes & Noble bookstore in a strip mall in Fairfield, California, on April 25, 2010, 1 year before Michelle. But just 2 weeks after she was reported missing, Fong Lei's remains were found by a woman walking her dog on a rural road in Napa County. Although there were no suspects, investigators did classify Fong Lei's death as a homicide. Fong's case was still open and unsolved, so it was hard for the detectives on her case not to think Michelle's was connected. It seemed like this could be another big break. There were just too many similarities. Were these types of women from Asian descent being targeted? Was this a hate crime of some kind? They weren't sure, but they wanted to look into it. This was bittersweet news to Michelle's family because, on one hand, this could be the break they needed to find Michelle, but Fong had been found dead, and they didn't want Michelle's story to end that way. Nevertheless, they brought this information to the Hayward police, but the investigator said that they did not believe these 2 cases were connected. They were just sad coincidences. Well, it felt like a slap in the face. Michelle's family believed that the Hayward Police Department didn't care about her because she was an adult. If Michelle had been a missing child, they believed her case would have been given way more priority. They refused to give up. They really needed to keep Michelle's name out there, so when the public interest in Michelle's disappearance began to go down, her uncle contacted a woman named Carrie Cave, formerly Carrie McGonigal. They needed her assistance, and I'd heard this name before but wasn't sure where. Well, Carrie McGonigal founded Team Amber Rescue to help find missing people in honor of her daughter Amber Dubois, and you may have heard that name before. Little Amber disappeared on her way to purchase a lamb as part of a farming program at Escondido High School back on February 23, 2009. She was only 14. In summary, it did not end well. Amber was murdered. However, nobody knew that at the time, and just like in this case, her family held out hope that they would find her. Then, almost exactly a year later on February 25, 2010, another young girl named Chelsea King, who was only 17, went missing from a local hiking trail in Rancho Bernardo Park. It wasn't long before her friends and family, just like Amber's, were searching all over for her. And sadly, they made a horrifying discovery. A pair of bloodied underwear and a sock were found only 2 miles from where Chelsea had parked her car. Then a shoe was found a mile from the clothes. It was a grim trail toward the ultimate discovery. After 5 days of searching, a dive team recovered Chelsea's body, and eventually the man responsible for murdering Chelsea admitted that he did the same thing to poor Amber and led them to her body. These poor parents, it's senseless. These girls were just starting their lives. After Amber's remains were located, her mother Carrie founded Team Amber Rescue. It helped her find peace because she provides other families with resources and expertise to help them find their loved ones, including her best tool, a dog, Amber, also named after her daughter. So, when Michelle's uncle contacted Carrie, she agreed to come out to the search, but she also put them in touch with another search organization in Northern California, run by her friend Mark Klass. His foundation is called Klass Kids Foundation, and you could have guessed that he formed it for similar reasons. Because on October 1st, 1993, Mark Klass's 12-year-old daughter, Polly Klass, was kidnapped while having a sleepover at her own home. Mark and his family, like so many others, used every resource they could to find Polly. But just 2 months later, their worst nightmare became a reality. Her murderer was pulled over for a traffic violation, and it's at that point he was arrested. After that, he led the police to Polly Klass's body, but Mark Klass founded the Klass Kids Foundation after the murder of his daughter Polly so that he could help families find their loved ones by providing a proven method. His techniques are tested, tried, and true. He runs a very organized search operation with a lot of rules and regulations that he's perfected over time for success. So both Mark and Carrie met with Michelle's family. They were in a hotel at the time, and it was a very sad moment when Mark walked into that room. It was dark. You could just feel the sadness in the room. Everyone was just sitting there. They were just in their pajamas. It looked like they hadn't even looked in the mirror in days. They were disheveled. They didn't know what to do. They were losing hope. However, what he knew he had to do was attempt to mend the relationship between Michelle's family and the Hayward police. He knew all too well that they needed to cooperate if they wanted to get anywhere. They can't know where to search without some type of lead. And even though Michelle's loved ones had tried to cooperate, they were most likely too emotional and not asking the right questions. It's really hard. You don't think like an investigator because you are a loved one. But Mark explained to Michelle's relatives that they needed the assistance of the authorities to find Michelle. There was obviously a lot that the police knew that the family did not. The first thing Mark did was give everyone in Michelle's family a list of things to do. They needed to form a search party to find volunteers, and he also taught them some key things about how searches work and how they can be the most successful. One of those things was to start from the center and work their way out, because in most cases, people who go missing are found within 1 to 5 miles of where they were last seen. Mark, being well-versed in working with the police, went to the Hayward Police Department to speak with the investigators, and it wasn't long before he built up a rapport. Finally, Inspector Ritchie was open to providing the family with much-needed information. Of course, it couldn't hurt. The detectives needed any help they could get when it came to searching, especially if it meant additional resources. So, he provided them with Michelle's cell phone ping locations. Michelle's phone had left a digital footprint after leaving the medical center's parking lot. The pings were traced throughout busy streets, then onto a very small 2-lane road. After that, it was tracked to a major freeway and then kind of out into the middle of nowhere, and then back to the medical center, taking the same roads between 7:17 and 9:06 p.m. Following the roads and then making a 5-mile radius meant that they would be going into some very rural areas, rugged terrain. This included canyons, rocky areas, streams, rivers, muddy banks, and it was already day 49 when this search started. They were searching a steep canyon area east of San Francisco Bay called Niles Canyon in Sunol. This area is about a 25-minute drive from Kaiser Hospital, but as you can see, it is a much different terrain from the city. And I know we hear this a lot, but it truly is like trying to look for a needle in a haystack. To make sure this search was organized and used time wisely, there was a system in place. As an area was thoroughly searched, they would tie a pink ribbon to a tree, and that would signify that the next searcher could go forward and not stop there. To maximize their efforts, they also marked areas that were concerning and that they wanted the police to investigate, to look into something that looked like it was evidence. But that was also hard, because there were a lot of people living in this area who did not have homes. They would come to this area to sleep and live, and there was a lot of debris, old food, garbage, and it was hard to differentiate between evidence and trash. There were also areas where they would find things like a sleeping bag. It was scary. They didn't know what they were going to find inside, but it turned out to be empty. When they went further into that area, though, they found a bone, a big bone, and it looked like it could be human. But then they found remains that indicated it was actually from a large animal, so they moved on. However, there was more. When searchers were crossing a creek, they saw yet another very large bone. It looked like it could have been a thigh bone, and it also looked human, so they decided to fan out and look in this area for belongings that could be associated with a person. They found shorts and other articles of clothing, but nothing that looked like Michelle's clothing. It didn't match anything that they knew she would have been wearing. However, they did send this bone in to be analyzed, and it did come back human. But it belonged to someone who was about 6 feet tall, and it had been there a long time. It was sad to know that another person had ended up dead in this area. It is the perfect place to put something that you don't want found, that's for sure. The search went on a long time. 2 months had already passed since Michelle had gone missing, and though the family kept up their press conferences begging for Michelle's kidnapper to return her, they must have known that she wasn't alive, right? I mean, you're looking in a canyon. They couldn't have believed that Mark and his team were looking for Michelle, camped out there or being held captive. But Mark never said that to them because he needed them to have hope inside. But it was true. Mark and his team were looking for Michelle's remains. Who was left of the vibrant young woman who had so much life to live? As the summer approached, the weather got hot. I'm talking like 100 degrees, especially where they were searching. So many of the volunteers called it quits. It was over 100 degrees, actually, and so far any of the leads they thought they had, like a pair of pink shorts, for example, ended up leading them nowhere. Meanwhile, as I told you, the investigators from the Hayward Police Department were doing searches of their own. They were still interviewing people, still analyzing evidence. Richie had watched that video of Michelle walking to her car so many times, hundreds, and he noticed something. This is so telling. Michelle's walking in a straight line, just casually making her way to her car, which is off camera to the right. What she does when she gets to where it's parked, she veers off to the left, like she's trying to avoid something or someone. Why did she see someone? She had an interaction with them before going toward her car. Well, Richie now believes that he knows what may have happened to her. He thinks that she made her way to her car, and someone's waiting for her. She saw them and was taken by surprise. This person or persons must have said something that made Michelle at least feel like it was okay to walk toward her vehicle. Maybe she knew them. But once she got to that passenger side, she was attacked. This is apparent from the blood in the front seat of the passenger area, the blood on the floor. But ultimately, she was put inside the back passenger side of the car. This matches up with the smears on the parking garage floor, with the smears in the car, with the blood droplets. Everything matches up to that theory. So, Richie thinks he may find more information by interviewing the students and staff at Samuel Merritt in relation to instructors, how these instructors are granted access to certain areas of the campus. He was told that their badges are used as key cards to open doors in classrooms and designated areas where they are permitted to be. So remember the badge that was found in the front seat of Michelle's car? The adjunct instructor, Elaine San Augustine's badge. Well, this is another lead Richie wants to pull. Any data linking this card that they found in Michelle's car to any door on the campus building. He wants to know any doors accessed on the day that Michelle went missing. He goes to speak with the program's administrative assistant, Karen Casper. She was in charge of creating these ID badges, and she explained that the last time she saw that badge was actually the day before Michelle went missing, Thursday, May 26th. It was on her desk, along with a new hire folder with all of Elaine's paperwork. But then, when Richie called and asked about it, she realized it was gone. So the security department ran a search, and they were able to pinpoint when the badge was used first, and it was around 5:17 the evening prior to Michelle's disappearance. Once they found this evidence, everything was about to come together, and I'm telling you, this is a crazy story. It's a scary story. Colleges, at least modern ones, typically are places that have a lot of cameras, almost everywhere. So Richie asked the security team to pull the videos from the door that the badge was used on. They wanted to see who was using it, and sure enough, it's a woman matching the description on the ID. She had dark hair, pulled into a ponytail. The woman was wearing a hat and a scarf, and she also kind of resembled Michelle in a way. She was younger, and it was hard to tell what she looked like because she wasn't facing the camera. Her back was turned. They couldn't see her face. She entered a back faculty door of the school with the key card. She made her way up to where Michelle's nursing classes are held. Here she is, going through the faculty entrance, wearing black leggings, a dark-colored shirt, and she's all alone. She wasn't following anyone. So, could this be the new instructor getting acquainted with her new workplace? It looked like it could be. She goes in, she's just looking around. But then they see something odd. She's trying to open office doors and they're locked. So she would move on to the next one, trying each one of the doorknobs, making her way down the hall. Then at one point she spots someone else and she kind of backs up. This isn't normal. If she was permitted in this area, why would she be acting this way? It gave me the chills watching it. At first I thought, is it Michelle trying to sneak in, like change her grades because she wanted to get straight A's? And did this instructor catch her? Did the instructor confront her in the parking lot the next day and something happened? It was really eerie seeing this footage. Who is this person? Well, she makes her way into a classroom, and this time she kind of does seem casual and calm, sort of just checking out the space. Then she turns the lights off and leaves the room. When she returns, she doesn't even turn them back on. Now she's wearing a white lab coat and holding what looks like a clipboard with a class roster on it. It's looking more and more like this is the new instructor. She's there after hours, checking out the class, but she's supposed to be in Hawaii. The investigator gets a good look at that paper in her hand, and it was the class roster. They could see pictures of the students on it. The woman's not doing anything weird or suspicious. I mean, unless this wasn't the instructor at all. Then it would be odd for some random person to be walking around the campus after hours, checking computer screens, looking at the class roster, a roster that most certainly included Michelle Lay's picture and information on it, including her shifts at the Kaiser Hospital. So, Richie is informed that Elaine San Augustine was indeed in Hawaii on May 26th before Michelle even went missing. It couldn't have been her on that video footage. So this meant whoever had that badge had stolen it. But how and when and why? They scrubbed through hours of footage until they spot the same woman earlier the same day, around 8 a.m. First, the administrative assistant Karen Casper opens the door to the front office. The woman comes inside, wearing the same black leggings and long-sleeved, dark-colored shirt. This time her hair is down, but they still can't see her face. She sits on the couch, waiting, and then, all of a sudden, Karen walks out. That's when this girl walks right into her office. There was definitely enough time for her to steal that badge. Then, she walks out and bam, she looks right into the camera while passing underneath. They finally get a glimpse of her face. They study it. It's definitely a grainy video. Who do you think it looks like? I know you don't have an entire list of people that were friends of Michelle's, but she looks familiar to Richie. He thinks it's Jazelle Esteban, but it's so hard to tell. Right after this, at 8:40 a.m., the camera spots her again. She's walking inside campus. Clearly, she's the one that stole the badge. Still, if this is Jazelle, why would she steal a badge and aimlessly walk the halls of the school? Did Michelle tell her to do this, or was she the one that harmed Michelle? Detectives don't know how that would be possible, because this woman is only a little over 5 feet tall and pregnant. So Richie rules her out merely on size and stature. Take a look. This is what she looked like. Plus, he met her in person, and he just didn't think that was a possibility. If she was involved, she definitely had help. But this is the biggest lead they have, so they have to run with it. Richie thinks that perhaps Scott and Jazelle concocted a plan to harm Michelle. They're really leaning towards Scott being the one that carried this out, because he had enough strength to overpower Michelle easily and put her into her car. So they need to find him and ask him some very pressing questions. They also had some questions for the administrative assistant who interacted with this mystery woman who stole the badge. So they set out on those two objectives. According to Karen, a prospective student came into the school around 8 a.m. and told her that she was interested in enrolling in the nursing program. She said that she had an appointment with the student services counselor. So Karen leaves to go locate that counselor, but she wasn't on campus that day. Karen goes back to speak with the prospective student herself. Then afterward, the girl leaves. But we know that she didn't, because we saw the footage of her going into that break room and walking around campus. Richie knew he needed to re-interview Scott, but before he had a chance to reach out to him, Scott gets in touch with Richie himself. It's May 29th and Scott calls him. He's out of breath and tells the inspector that he's cleaning out his car and just found what he thinks is Michelle's white iPhone under a back seat floor mat. Scott was instructed to turn the phone over to the blue switch. He did, and now Richie has a chance to go talk to him. He just happens to find Michelle's phone? It seems just a little too coincidental, don't you think? Is this some kind of ruse to come forward first so that they don't go looking for him? Richie considers Scott possibly trying to outsmart the police and maybe claiming someone's trying to set him up. Richie wasn't sure, but it was time to ask Scott a lot of questions. Scott explained a lot, and a lot of things we already heard from Jazelle, that he and Michelle had met through her, that they all went to college together back in 2003. When asked what the status of his relationship was with both women, he pretty much says he's got no relationship, none with Jazelle. But that wasn't exactly true because he had a child with Jazelle, and he had just been texting Michelle. He explains at this point that he tries to have as little contact with Jazelle as possible, only what's necessary to facilitate their court-ordered visitations. Jazelle's a shop around, that's what he tells Richie, and that's something Jazelle did not mention. Scott says he now has full custody of their daughter, and he's had it since August of 2010. Recall that high-conflict parenting therapy session? Well, that was due to the legal proceedings that the couple were going through at the time, and that was Scott's attempt to take Isabel away from Jazelle. Richie wasn't sure what any of this had to do with Michelle yet, but it seemed at the very least that Scott needed to get all of this off his chest. So Richie took it all in, and there was a lot. But Scott promised he was getting somewhere with all of these stories. In the beginning, he said that all three of them were very close friends. They hung out all the time, and he thought that Jazelle and Michelle got along really well. He reiterated what Jazelle said set her off in the first place, the time that Michelle confided in him about the fact she was pregnant. But Scott insisted he and Michelle were merely platonic, and that Michelle was just going to him for advice. She wasn't ready to tell Jazelle because of her pride, not because Scott was the father. Things seemed to blow over for a while with Jazelle, but their relationship was off to a rocky start. It came to an end in 2005, but he was still sleeping with her at the time, here and there. That's when she told him she was pregnant with his baby. He tried to make it work with her, but it was a nightmare, according to him, especially after the baby was born. It seemed as though she might have had something like postpartum depression. Something set her off because all of a sudden she started to accuse Scott of hanging out with Michelle, and once again, becoming upset over the belief that she had that they were more than friends. Scott once again tried to convince her otherwise, but the issue was that Scott just would not kick Michelle out of his life. He wasn't that kind of person. They had mutual friends within the Vietnamese community. Yet, he did stop talking to her for a while upon Jazelle's request. They were living together for 3 years, but their relationship was toxic, and they separated for good in 2008. At that point, Jazelle had custody and a move-away order, so she took Isabel back to San Diego, and Scott shared custody. He would go back and forth and visit his daughter as much as he could, which was a lot. As a matter of fact, he wanted full custody, and that decision came in 2009. Jazelle said she was going to move in with her new boyfriend, and Isabel was coming with her. Scott wasn't okay with it, so he filed for full custody in November of 2009. This would take several months to go into the legal proceedings and get finalized, and by April 2010, Jazelle had broken up with that new guy. She was living back in Northern California, and she told Scott she was pregnant again but having an abortion. After this, Scott said he would backslide. He would sleep with her again. He just had a soft spot whenever she was in need. But they just could not have a relationship because they were toxic, and they were both at fault in many instances. But he explained that Jazelle had mental health conditions and made it nearly impossible to deal with her. He also told Richie that, due to these apparent issues Jazelle was facing, Michelle wanted nothing to do with her for a while. It was obvious that Jazelle wanted someone to blame her breakup on, and she felt like Michelle was just the perfect person. Scott explains Michelle had nothing to do with it. It was Jazelle's own behavior and her downward spiral over the years that made him leave. He said, "I have 7 years' worth of domestic records involving Jazelle, and that definitely sounded like a lot to deal with. But what does this have to do with Michelle? How does Michelle fit into all this?" Was Scott suggesting that Jazelle had something to do with what happened to Michelle over a relationship that ended 4 years ago? Because it wasn't really adding up. It was actually starting to make Scott look more suspicious, almost as though he was trying to make excuses as to maybe why he had done something. Richie wants to understand how Michelle fits in and what Scott's current relationship with her looks like. That's when he admits he was hanging out with Michelle, especially more recently, and he was keeping it a secret from Jazelle because he didn't want to deal with the drama. Even though back in August of 2010 it seemed as though, with that meeting with the 3 of them at the therapist's office, that he provided closure, Scott said it didn't. It only made things worse. Because remember, they admitted to her, "We were talking, we were hanging out, but we were just friends." That meant they were still lying. Jazelle truly believed Michelle tore her family apart. It was actually after that meeting that she started to bombard Scott with really mean messages about Michelle, calling her all types of names and really sharing her hatred for her. Scott said that she was obsessed with Michelle. She was fixated on this fantasy where she could place all the blame on Michelle for her life not going well while Michelle's was thriving. It was more than jealousy, and I am not going to go into 7 years' worth of reports between Scott and Jazelle, but in order for Richie to understand who Jazelle was, it was imperative that he go through all of them. I'm going to highlight a few, and these were reported by both Jazelle and Scott. It was back and forth, so toxic, so much drama. No wonder people want to stay single sometimes. For example, in 2008, Jazelle had swallowed an excessive number of pills and then attacked Scott, hitting him in the stomach, and there was a witness to this. So, Jazelle was arrested, but then the same year Scott was arrested for pushing Jazelle through a doorway and endangering his daughter who was present for this altercation. But then another time, Jazelle destroyed Scott's computer. But then, he was the initial aggressor, according to the report. Jazelle would constantly threaten to harm herself if Scott didn't answer her texts or her calls or come see her. This is why he couldn't get away. He said he would leave her for a while, and then something would happen, some crisis, and he would have to come to her rescue. One time, she called him crying and begging for him to come over, saying that her finger on the trigger and she didn't want to pull it. Wow, she would even lay in the middle of the road while there were cars coming, and he would sit there yelling for her to get up, and she wouldn't. He had to physically grab her and throw her to the side of the road. That is scary. On one hand, I think it's easy for us to judge her and call her crazy, but clearly this woman needed help. She was hurting, and Scott wanted to be there for the mother of his child, even though he didn't want to be with her. He was stuck between, like they say, a rock and a hard place. She would constantly get him arrested by claiming she was a battered woman, and the cops would believe her because she had marks all over her body, marks that she made. So Richie begins to feel bad for Scott. He's been through a lot, especially at such a young age, but it doesn't mean that he's not trying to get back at Jazelle by implicating her in Michelle's case. But Scott finally says, "I have nothing to do with Michelle's disappearance, and none of these domestic issues have ever been prosecuted in a court of law, so no one has ever been determined to be guilty. They're merely reports." He just wanted to prove, that he was a good guy, that he's not really guilty of any of these things. It's just a he said, she said situation. He wanted to show Richie that Jazelle has the ability to be violent, and that she's not this sweet, innocent little petite pregnant girl with a kid. If there's anyone that Jazelle would have her eye set on to harm, he believes it would be Michelle. But Richie wants to know why, and Scott explains that just a few months ago, Jazelle had become increasingly obsessed over Michelle, and he has proof. He pulls out his phone. Scott had started to record conversations, screenshot text messages, anything he could, because he was becoming more and more afraid of Jazelle. These are some of the items he used as evidence to get custody of his daughter. It started back in November of 2010. Scott played a voice recording for Richie that he had saved. It was an argument between him and Jazelle. She was once again rehashing the accusation that Scott and Michelle had slept together and that he had driven her to get this abortion. We're talking about something that occurred years ago, but she was acting as though it happened the day before. And Scott, he's sitting there trying to remain calm, but it is very hard to do so. This was 7 months ago, but Scott's like, wait, there's more. So on February 17th, 2011, this is just 3 months before Michelle goes missing, Jazelle asks Scott to meet her at a coffee shop. Things were okay until Jazelle brings up this story about how someone has this big problem with Michelle and that Jazelle is finally going to let this person know where they can find her and teach her a lesson. That type of thing. She tells Scott that this person is going to go to a party where Michelle's at and they're going to use something to disfigure her, like acid or a weapon. Well, Scott doesn't want to hear any of this. He's terrified, so he refused to discuss it any further. And that's when Jazelle literally throws a coffee at him. Yeah, and then later that night, she's begging him for forgiveness, acting as though she was the victim of Scott's poor choices, as she liked to call it. She told him that she was still angry about what he did with Michelle, and that she hadn't even begun to forgive them. That same night, Scott became aware that Jazelle sent a text to both him and Michelle. And this is what the one to Michelle said. "If you really were anyone's friend, mine or Scott's, you would just F off and leave my family alone. But all you are is who had nothing better to do and followed me to San Francisco. That's all you'll ever be. The split of who slept with other people's men and brothers because no one wanted you. You aren't my friend. You are always just a parasite." Just seconds later, Jazelle sent a text to both Scott and Michelle, which said, "You two really do deserve each other. I hope you get what you deserve. You are both pathetic. You, Scott, with no dreams or goals, and the other chasing after someone else's dreams because she has none of her own. You are both parasites." But in reality, Jazelle was projecting her own behavior. She had given up on her dreams. She didn't have any goals other than seemingly making other people's lives miserable, and it was truly sad. Michelle had better things to do at this point than to respond to this nonsense, so she ignored Jazelle's texts and calls. Well, this didn't make Jazelle very happy. The very next day, on February 18th, she sent Scott a number of messages about Michelle, calling him an idiot and telling him to stop falling for Michelle's act. She warned him that Michelle better stop avoiding her calls because this won't end unless she does. But it didn't end there. She told him that their daughter was already aware that he had picked his over his family, and went on to complain that Scott hadn't even given her a birthday present yet. Instead, he decided to blow his money on his... And because of all of this, Jazelle took the liberty of letting Michelle's boyfriend know all about their history. And Michelle? That was another thing. She had a serious boyfriend this whole time. She dated Tommy for years while this was going on. By the end of February, Jazelle was continuing to send nasty messages to Scott. She told him that he had pushed her into insanity and that he would have to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. She threatened Michelle's life by telling Scott that he wasn't going to be able to protect anyone. That will get what she deserves too, she said, and I have many ways to make him pay for what he's done. She even told him that maybe he should just get it over with and put a bullet in his own head because with him dead, their world would be a better place. You and Michelle will pay for your mistakes, she added, and I'm busy planning your demise. The thing is, I told you Scott was hanging out with Michelle, and Jazelle was watching them. She followed them to places and knew they were together, and that only made this worse. If someone's telling you they're not doing something, but they really are, I don't know. Some people call it gaslighting or worse. You can start to feel like you're going crazy, but maybe Jazelle really was. In March, she told Scott that she had seen him and Michelle together. She asked him, "Why do you keep lying?" And like I said, to be fair, he was lying, and he admitted that to Richie. He was lying because he didn't want to deal with the drama, but it didn't matter whether he hung out with Michelle or not because Jazelle was already of the mindset that they had always been in a relationship behind her back. She texted him, saying that Michelle dug her grave by being a homewrecker and but that she wouldn't be an issue for long. She told Scott, "You keep seeing your I tried every positive approach, and you still keep running back to the who made you lie to your family. So now I choose to take the negative and obliterate you and your baggage-toting from my family. You'll never have a good name again. My question is, why not go to the police with all this like a long time ago if this person's threatening your life and someone else's life? And I promise there's just a few more of these instances, but they just get closer and closer to the time that Michelle goes missing." On March 17th, Jazelle texted, "FYI, she won't pass her midterms." That's such an eerie thing to say since we know that she's gone now. On March 18th, Scott drove over to Jazelle's apartment. He was going to pick up some Girl Scout cookies he had ordered from his daughter. Jazelle was supposed to leave the items outside because Scott didn't want to have a confrontation with her, but that's not what happened. When he pulls up, there's a little girl in the car with him. She gets into the passenger side of his car, and he knew he was going to have to record this conversation. He just knew it wasn't going to go well. He could sense it. Their little daughter was in the car with them. And like many times before, Jazelle used what had made Scott break, what made him have a soft spot for her. She said, "I'm pregnant with your baby." Now she actually was pregnant, but Scott didn't believe it. Then, Jazelle went right into the conversation about Michelle again. She told Scott she tried reasoning with him in a nice way, but he was still seeing Michelle more than he was even seeing her. In this recording, Jazelle is heard saying, "I asked you if you could just be honest about Michelle, because she is the one issue I'm really having a hard time dealing with." And it was like, fine, okay, starting now we're going to be honest about Michelle. Whether you sleep with her, you share food with her, whether you talk to her. And then suddenly Jazelle yelled, "Look at me. Be honest with me regarding her, otherwise I will take her life and yours, and you can take that to the grave with you." All Scott could say was, "Why?" Jazelle responded, Because you lied about her so many times, it's just hard to believe you didn't sleep with her. You deserve to die for your lies, and so does she. If you do this again, this is your last and final warning. This was chilling. I have some of this recording to play for you. It starts with Jazelle saying, "Starting now, we are going to be honest about Michelle. Do you understand me? Whether you sleep with her, whether you share food with her, whether you talk to her, you will be honest with me. Look at me. You will be honest with me regarding her, otherwise I will take your life and hers, and you can take that to the grave with you." Scott responds, "Why?" And Jazelle says, "Because it's your last and final warning." Then you can hear their daughter in the background, her little voice saying, "Mommy." Jazelle immediately changes her tone and says, "Yes, honey, what's wrong?" Then she tells her impressionable daughter, "Mommy doesn't like being lied to." That's really sad. Jazelle then asks Scott if he loved her, and man, this guy had some guts. He was honest and told her, no. After this, Jazelle started to punch herself in the face over and over again with her keys, and Scott was pleading for her to stop. This was in front of their daughter. He threatened to call the police, and she responded, "Go ahead, because they're going to end up arresting you anyway." And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. But the charges were dropped. They were dismissed, just like they were so many other times in the past. But this next part is crucial to listen to. It's where Richie really gets a sense of a pattern of Jazelle's behavior, and things start to add up for him. On May 20th, just a week before Michelle goes missing, Jazelle went over to Scott's to pick up Isabel for a supervised visit. I'm sure you've heard of this before. This is where you have to be with a social worker, and that person was supposed to be there to make sure things went smoothly. But they couldn't stop Jazelle. She walked right past them into Scott's house, where he was living with his parents, and she was acting very erratic. She was causing a scene, upsetting everyone. She finally left, but then Scott realized his car keys were missing. Now, that's a very important part of this incident, because that's what led Richie to believe the possibility that Jazelle may have planted Michelle's phone in Scott's car, if Scott was telling the truth, because Richie had only heard Scott's version of these events so far. Scott said that 2 days later, on May 22nd, he was woken up really early in the morning by the sound of his car alarm going off out of nowhere. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. When he went out to investigate, he looked around, and he didn't see anything. But then he stopped when he heard his mom screaming. He turned and ran back inside, and he saw Jazelle coming out of his bedroom. At this point, his mom had actually come down while Scott was outside and saw Jazelle standing inside her granddaughter's bedroom. So she yelled at Jazelle, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here." Jazelle turned around, kind of thinking this was funny, like it was comical, and said, "I'm just messing with your son." And that's when she ran into Scott's bedroom. By the time he got there, he saw her running outside, and he followed her to his gate out in the back or the front. She was laughing. He said, "Give me my keys." She said, "I don't have them." Later he found out not only did she probably steal his keys, but she had hacked into his computer. Any emails that he had ever sent between him and Michelle were forwarded to Jazelle's email address and then deleted from his computer. All of his court-related files pertaining to her and anything that had Jazelle's name on it was missing. It was in that moment Scott decided to apply for a restraining order against Jazelle, and his parents came with him to the courthouse. They made statements in regard to this incident because they wanted to protect Scott and their granddaughter. Richie asked if Scott had any recent contact with Jazelle, to which he said, "Sort of." Scott explains that at 1 o'clock in the morning, the night Michelle disappeared, Jazelle texted Scott with, "Where is Michelle?" He was asleep and didn't respond. Later that morning, Jazelle was late to pick up Isabel from Scott's house for another supervised visit. Richie realized it was time to bring Jazelle back into the station for more extensive questioning. They also wanted to get a copy of her phone record. So Jazelle came in. They kind of went back over everything they had already talked about and asked her when the last time she spoke to Michelle was. Jazelle said that she had called Michelle several times in the days leading up to when she was reported missing and left messages, but none of them were ever answered. Richie wanted to know the reasons for these calls, considering Jazelle was no longer really hanging out with Michelle at this point. Jazelle explained it was to make sure Michelle was staying away from Isabel. Richie asked if Michelle had something going on, if she was interfering with her child or getting into her business somehow, and Jazelle said no. It was just that Michelle would surface every now and then, and Jazelle would hear about it from her 5-year-old daughter. Interesting, Richie said. He then asked to see her call log. Jazelle had a red BlackBerry Curve cell phone, and that's when she explained, "Oh, well, you may not find any messages to Michelle, because I have them automatically deleted." She further explained that the reason she might have some copies of older messages that she sent to other people was because she manually saved them. "I've never heard of this feature on the phone. Correct me if I'm wrong. I've also never really liked BlackBerry, so I'm not sure," Richie said. Richie asked Jazelle what she was doing the evening that Michelle went missing. Jazelle said she had a very boring day. She took a walk that evening because she was feeling a little restless. She talked on the phone with her friend Virgily, and after that, she eventually fell asleep on the couch. "Okay," Richie said, "what about during the daytime?" Jazelle said that morning, she went to volunteer at Isabel's school. Then she came home and took a nap. Around 4:15, she decided to go over to the hospital in her area, the Kaiser Union City location, to talk about her pregnancy coverage, because she was pregnant with Scott's baby. "Wow, wait a minute. This is all really interesting," Richie thought. She explained that the location near her was closed, so she went to the closest one, which was the Hayward location, and that's the one that Michelle worked at. Richie thought this was very interesting. She said that she parked in the parking lot on the 3rd floor, which is in the maternity ward, since that's where she was headed to check on everything she needed for upcoming pregnancy appointments. But once she got inside, she realized that the member services department was closed. So she just used the bathroom real fast, then went back to her car and went home. She admitted, without prompting, that she saw Michelle walking on the pedestrian bridge. She wasn't close enough to know for sure if it was her, but she was pretty sure. Richie asked, "Well, what time was that?" Jazelle said, "Oh, I don't know. 6 o'clock? 6:30, maybe?" This put Jazelle in the same parking lot around the same time Michelle had gone to her car the last time she was seen before she disappeared. Richie asked if there was any type of encounter with Michelle. That's when Jazelle asked, "Do I need to talk to an attorney or something?" Richie said, "You're not under arrest. We're not accusing you of anything. We're just asking questions." Well, Jazelle wasn't so confident about that and asked whether they were talking to anyone else, because Michelle, according to Jazelle, had slept with a lot of people's boyfriends. Wow, Richie thought. It's like she can't help but bash this poor girl. Richie said, "Well, we have all the footage of that parking garage and we can go through it at the exact time you said you were there. Is it going to show any kind of confrontation with you and Michelle?" Jazelle replied, "I don't know." She said she couldn't recall ever having a discussion or an altercation of any kind. She kinda doesn't know much about those days, and she was already in her car when she spotted Michelle on that bridge. She got home around 7 p.m. and texted some friends. Richie said, "You realize that you were at her workplace and she goes missing. You know how that looks, right?" Jazelle admitted, "Yeah, the circumstances look bad, obviously, but I don't know what happened to Michelle or where she is." Richie admitted that he was having trouble believing how little Jazelle remembered about what happened that day. Jazelle said that she had been off her medication because she was pregnant. Now this is where things get very interesting. It's true, when you're pregnant, doctors will sometimes take you off of certain medications, especially ones that are prescribed for mental health ailments. But they usually have to weigh the pros and cons of doing so. So Richie wanted to know, what medications are you on and what are they for? Jazelle says lithium, but that she doesn't know what her diagnosis was. I'm sorry, but who doesn't know their own medical diagnosis? That seemed very odd. But being off a much-needed medication is concerning. Putting the timeline together, it would mean that Jazelle could have stopped her meds around February or March. Recall that a lot of this aggressive behavior in relation to Scott and Michelle began in and around February. The texts, the threats, the behavior that Scott related to investigators. Now, granted, yes, they have had altercations in the past, but it's just something they pointed out to note. Richie told her that if there was some kind of fight, now would be a good time to tell him about it. She responded that she didn't know and that she doesn't know what happened to Michelle. She'd been sleeping a lot lately and forgetting a lot of things. That's when Richie used a tactic. When you lie to someone, you're allowed to do this when they're being questioned to elicit information about a crime. He says that he has footage of Jazelle's car driving past Michelle's car. Jazelle was like, "Yeah, I probably did, but I had no idea that Michelle even worked there until after I saw her walking across the bridge, and by that time, I was already leaving to go back home." At this point, Richie is in the process of getting a warrant to search Jazelle's apartment and her car, and he really wanted to know if they were going to find anything of Michelle's inside. She says, "I'm pretty sure you're not. Pretty sure you're not going to find anything of my previous BFF inside my home." He asked her what she did on Saturday, and she said she took her daughter to Chuck E. Cheese's. Then she stopped talking so she could text someone, and apparently it was her friend Virgeli. They were advising her by text to stop talking to the police. Jazelle says, "My friend is telling me, I have an alibi, and I should stop talking to you now," and she was laughing when she shared this with Richie. He said, "Why would someone not want you to help the police find a missing person?" Jazelle explained that she and her friend did not trust the police because they had been in situations where the police never helped them when they were both victims of domestic altercations. Jazelle also suggested that maybe Michelle didn't want to be found. Do you ever think of that? Maybe Michelle's not really missing. And if the police were really looking for her, they should go do it instead of sitting there questioning me. She'd become a little emotional and said she didn't want Michelle to be gone. And even though they weren't really friends, she was never really a friend. She wasn't an enemy either. However, while Richie was going through her call log, she explained that she and Michelle did used to have text wars before she changed her number. That's when Richie sees 2 calls that Jazelle made to the Kaiser Hospital where Michelle works. He asked her about these calls and she said, "Yeah, I made 2 calls to the member services about my insurance coverage for my pregnancy." That's when Richie asked if Jazelle had called Kaiser the day before Michelle went missing, looking for Michelle. She's like, "No, I went there to ask about the nursing program. I don't recall asking about the nursing students." Richie assured her that the calls were recorded, so he would just check the records. At this point, I was so invested. I'm like, this girl is so connected to this crime. It's obvious. And now Richie had a call log showing that Jazelle, who says she merely went to the hospital to check on her maternity benefits, actually called there the day before asking about the nursing program. She's not even graduated from college, so that would be very premature. And it's way too much of a coincidence. Way too much. The interview was about to wrap up, because Richie knew he needed to look into a lot of what Jazelle had just told him. But he wanted to know one thing. He asked, "What did Michelle do or say that was so bad that would prompt you to have text wars and such?" Jazelle said that just being around her daughter was not okay, because her daughter was getting the impression that Michelle was her new mommy. Then, Richie asked about the reason Scott's mom had issues with Jazelle, enough to actually assist him in getting this restraining order, to which Jazelle replied, "Oh, Scott's mom is just trying to keep her son out of jail, which is something that she did all the time." Richie just had a couple more things to cover to be thorough. He asked Jazelle if she had ever been to Michelle's new car. She said she didn't remember, but she didn't think so because she didn't even know Michelle had a new car. At this point, Jazelle was free to go, but they had gotten her entire call log and were able to download her phone records, as well as a warrant to search her apartment and a DNA swab for comparison to any DNA that they might find. By now, Richie believed it was Jazelle they saw in that video footage, and that she was the one who stole the badge, used it to enter the campus, and stole the roster with all that information about when and where Michelle would be the next day. This is one of my favorite parts. It's when they really start to piece together all the evidence. Because even if they have a hunch, that's never good enough. They need concrete proof. Since they have Jazelle's phone records and call log, they can make a timeline of where her phone was. The records show that Jazelle made several calls to both Samuel Merritt and Kaiser, starting on Wednesday, May 25th. She placed 2 calls to the nursing school. Then the next day, on Thursday, the 26th, when the badge was taken, she called Kaiser at 10:45 a.m., then again at 2:30 p.m. A priest who worked at All Saints Catholic Church in Hayward, California, had sent in a tip regarding Michelle's case. He said that on May 26th, the day before Michelle went missing, at 3 p.m., he saw a young woman sitting on a patio outside his office. She was wearing white medical scrubs and looked upset. When the priest asked the woman several times if she wanted to go into the confessional, she said no. This is why he was able to speak with the investigator. The woman simply said that she was there to ask for forgiveness, and she needed it for something she hadn't done yet. Then, on the afternoon of May 27th, the day that Michelle was last seen, Jazelle made another call to Kaiser. Not only that, Jazelle actually used her phone while inside the Kaiser Hayward parking structure on May 26th at 4:12 p.m., 4:32 p.m., and 8:55 p.m. Then, on May 27th, the day Michelle disappeared from work, Jazelle's cell phone was in the Kaiser parking garage when she used it to send 91 text messages between the hours of 3:11 p.m. and 7:12 p.m. Now Richie goes to Kaiser to ask the staff about these calls. There's no question, right? But to build their case, Richie has to know the context of these calls. Were they to Michelle? Remember, Michelle changed her number. So, was Jazelle trying to reach out to her in another way? However, Jazelle said she didn't even know Michelle worked at Kaiser. Remember that statement, until she saw her on Friday night walking along that pedestrian bridge. So that means it was just a coincidence that Jazelle was calling to find out about her insurance benefits? Because Richie asked the staff at both the nursing school and Kaiser. Since Richie had all of Jazelle's texts, he created a timeline of these days, from May 25th to the days following Michelle's disappearance. On Wednesday, May 25th, Scott went to the courthouse to file for that restraining order. Well, Jazelle's GPS shows that she actually followed him there. She sat outside watching. And sometimes I think that these restraining orders do more harm than good. Sometimes it's what pushes someone over the edge, and honestly, they usually don't work very well. But after this, Jazelle sends several text messages to a guy named Alan. He's a friend from college who knows Michelle. Jazelle's asking for Michelle's new address. She's telling Alan that his girlfriend might have it, but don't tell his girlfriend or Michelle that she wanted it because she was trying to serve some restraining order papers to Michelle to stay away from her daughter. These papers keep getting returned from Michelle's Oakland address because apparently she has moved. That evening, Alan responded that neither he nor his girlfriend had Michelle's new address. The same day, Jazelle calls the nursing school twice. Richie takes the statement from Marjorie Villanova, a school administrator, and she said she remembers a woman calling in. Her name was Jamie. She sounded sweet, nice, friendly, and calm. She said, "I'm at the airport. I'm supposed to get together with my friend Michelle Lay. Can I have her phone number?" Of course, this administrator was like, no. So Jamie calls back again asking the same thing for Michelle's phone number. Once again, the administrative assistant said no, but she did say, "Let me get your number, Jamie, and I'll give this to Michelle." But the caller said that she was borrowing a phone. At this point, the admin left a message for Michelle that her friend Jamie was looking for her. And I wonder if that message was ever given to her. But the next morning, May 26th, at 8 a.m., is when the campus video footage catches Jazelle going to supposedly talk to a counselor about the school. It was at this point she steals the badge and then walks around campus into the break room, down the halls, before finally leaving. Then at 10:34 a.m., she calls Kaiser. The call was answered by Scott Moore, a charge nurse in the emergency department. The caller said that she was Michelle Lay and that she had just started an internship on Friday. The caller sounded so desperate to know the instructor's name and where she was supposed to report. But this call was strange because nursing students normally get this information from their school. So Scott told the woman on the phone that Michelle was not scheduled to work in the emergency department that Friday. It was as though Jazelle was just checking things off of her list like, oh, she's not going to be in the emergency department. She's going to be in another one. A few hours later, the woman called back and pretty much asked the same questions. Then again, at 2:30 p.m., the third call came in from Jazelle's cell phone to Kaiser. This was answered by nurse Bessie Wentz. The caller said, "I'm a skilled lab instructor for Samuel Merritt, and I need some information about the nursing students, if they're going to be there that night." Once confirmed that the students were there every Thursday and Friday, the nurse wouldn't provide any names of students who would be attending. Wow, this is so calculated. But of course I'm not done yet. The same day, Jazelle's phone pings at the Kaiser garage at 4:12 p.m., 4:32 p.m., and 8:55 p.m. She's in the garage at those times. Then the next day, on Friday, May 27th, the day Michelle actually goes missing from Kaiser, Nurse Scott Moore receives another phone call regarding Michelle. Jazelle called once again, this time pretending to be an instructor from Merritt. She said she needed to arrange a meeting with Michelle Lay. Scott knew the name she had just given was Michelle's previous instructor, and they weren't working that day. He knew the person and realized this definitely wasn't them calling, so he thought the call was very odd. The caller went on to tell him that Michelle was actually on probation, which was something that schools usually kept completely confidential, so he knew this wasn't even someone calling from the school. The caller was trying to confirm that Michelle was going to report for her program at 7 p.m. that night. Scott told the caller that 7 p.m. wasn't necessarily the start time, because programs can start earlier in the afternoon. That was the day that Jazelle sent 91 text messages from the parking lot between the hours of 3:11 p.m. and 7:12 p.m. Now remember, Michelle's car was seen in the parking garage sometime around 9 p.m., and around that same time Jazelle sent her friend Brian a text. It said, "Do not unlock an iPhone." She explained that she found one earlier that day at the Kaiser pharmacy. Lies, all lies, and Richie knows this. What do you even call this behavior? It's stalking, right? But I feel like there's got to be another name for it. Something that really defines the jealousy, the hatred, the calculation. Investigators theorized that Jazelle caused Michelle's death, but they needed to prove it. Without Michelle's body, that was extremely challenging. The police pulled Michelle's phone records and reviewed her pings from the night that she disappeared. They compared them to where Jazelle's phone had pinged, and as suspected, Jazelle and Michelle's phones left the parking garage at the same time. They tracked together on that same exact path through town, out into the canyon, and then back to the parking garage. Then to the final place where Michelle's car was parked, but then Michelle's phone stopped tracking. It was either turned off or it died. However, they continued to follow Jazelle's movement in the days following Michelle's disappearance. Her phone pinged at Scott's residence, where we know he said that she came for a supervised visit. Then it shocked to the Apple store at a mall nearby. Richie goes there, pulls that footage, and speaks to employees. Sure enough, one of the employees remembers Jazelle. He said she came in with her young daughter and said that her daughter was playing with the phone. Somehow her daughter accidentally put a passcode on it, and now they're locked out. Unbelievably, in my opinion, this Apple employee unlocked this phone for Jazelle. According to Michelle Lay's phone records, the moment that the Apple employee unlocked the phone, her phone turned back on and was pinging at a tower near the Apple store. The employee also mentioned that he recalled just how many notifications were coming through on the phone as soon as it turned on. It was going crazy with notifications. Here's that footage, the surveillance camera. You can see Jazelle and her daughter in the stroller with a social worker. That social worker had chaperoned that visit that day. You see Jazelle walk up and talk to an Apple employee. Then she leaves the store with a white phone in her hand. According to an interview with that social worker, Jazelle told her that her brother gave her that iPhone and that she needed to go get it set up at the Apple store. The social worker also explained that once they left the Apple store, Jazelle asked her to drive, and the entire time on their way to Chuck E. Cheese, all she did was text. This was most likely when everyone was getting those responses back from Michelle's phone. At 3 p.m., both phones tracked to Chuck E. Cheese, where the social worker, along with Jazelle, her daughter Isabel, and her nieces were. However, Jazelle hardly paid any attention to the children. She said she had to leave. She left the kids with the social worker and told her, "I left something burning on the stove in my apartment. I have to run back and go turn it off." The social worker said that Jazelle returned in less than an hour, and she no longer had the white iPhone. However, Jazelle's phone pinged near Scott's house. There was one other place her phone pinged that piqued Richie's interest. On the day of the candlelight vigil, Jazelle's phone pinged right near where Michelle's friends and family were gathering, including Scott. She never got out of her car to pay respects or to support the family. She obviously just drove around watching. They collected a number of items, including a pair of white shoes that were seen in video footage of Jazelle. These were also shoes that Jazelle had been adamant about wearing out of her apartment when they initially interviewed her. So, Richie definitely wanted them analyzed. Jazelle was kept under surveillance. A tracker was put on her car, and they monitored her whereabouts as they awaited those DNA results, which could take weeks. But eventually, the Hayward Police Department received the DNA results from Michelle's vehicle and Jazelle's shoes. According to those results, Jazelle's DNA was found on the turn signal of Michelle's car. A black hair on the passenger seat matched Jazelle's DNA. However, that evidence alone was not enough to charge Jazelle with Michelle's murder. However, not soon after this, they received the results from testing Jazelle's shoes. Michelle's blood was found on them, and they knew at this point they definitely had enough evidence to arrest Jazelle for the murder of Michelle Lay. But they weren't sure they would have enough to secure a guilty verdict at trial, since they still did not have Michelle's body to prove that she was indeed deceased. They were fearful for Scott and his daughter's safety, as well as for Michelle's family's safety, because Jazelle had already visited Isabel's school in defiance of the restraining order. She even tried to enter her classroom. So, Scott told the police, "The disregard of the restraining order makes me fearful that Jazelle may be increasingly unstable." He also mentioned that Jazelle had been diagnosed with manic depression and psychotic features, as well as a form of bipolar disorder. So the police decided to make an arrest in order to know where Jazelle was at any given moment, as they built their case against her. On September 7, 2011, 3 months after Michelle disappeared, the Hayward Police Department arrested Jazelle Esteban at her apartment. She didn't fight, she didn't argue, she just put her hands behind her back. She never even asked why she was being arrested. She just remained as cold as ice and didn't show any remorse. Of course, not knowing the details about the evidence investigators had found, Michelle's family was stunned. Of all people, Michelle's best friend from high school was being arrested for her murder, especially because they were still holding out hope that Michelle was still alive. There was no body found, so there wasn't closure at this point. The reward offered was up to $100,000 for Michelle's return, or information about her whereabouts. But now the family was able to know details. They were called to the police department and were told everything. It made sense. They saw everything. They saw Jazelle in the lab coat at the school, the DNA, the Apple Store footage. It was September 17th, 113 days after Michelle had gone missing, and just 10 days after they arrested Jazelle. Carrie and her dog Amber were combing through the canyon area on one of their searches. It was an area where Jazelle and Michelle's phones were stationary for at least 20 to 30 minutes on the night of the disappearance. Carrie let the search dog Amber off the leash. Amber was acting really odd. She was jumping all over the place, and the dog obviously wanted to get away from Carrie, so she just let her loose. A few seconds later, the dog returned and wanted Carrie to follow her. So she did. When she looked near a large tree stump, she saw what appeared to be white medical scrubs. When she got closer, Carrie saw what she believed looked like human remains. But all that was left was a skeleton. The body was severely decomposed, and it could not be identified merely by looking at it. They couldn't even tell if it was a male or female. The authorities were notified, and the remains were transported to the medical examiner's office for an official identification. What's sad is that Christine, who was back at the command post, got a phone call from a reporter, an insensitive one at that. They were calling to get her comment on the discovery of Michelle's remains. She was in shock. Christine told the reporter they didn't find Michelle, but something in her gut told her that they had. The identification took a couple of days. Dental records were used, and once again, Christine was just holding on to that hope until they had proof that those remains belonged to her favorite cousin. But by the evening of Monday, September 19th, just 2 days after the remains were found, the Alameda County Coroner's Bureau confirmed that they had found the remains of missing nursing student Michelle Lay. However, the forensic pathology examinations were still ongoing, and they could not determine the exact manner or cause of death yet. Following confirmation that the remains were Michelle's, her family stayed in their hotel room just to mourn her death. It was unbelievable to them. You never think anything like this can happen. Ultimately, Michelle's cause of death could never be determined because her body was too decomposed. However, the theory is that a sharp object, like a knife, was used to render Michelle unable to fight back against Jazelle. She was most likely wounded in the neck or the chest, somewhere that would incapacitate her very quickly. Jazelle was indicted on December 14, 2011, and she entered a plea of not guilty. The trial date was set for September 17, 2012. Jazelle's defense attorney was Andrea Auer, and the prosecutor on the case was Butch Ford. He was determined to dig up all he could on Jazelle, and one of the pieces of evidence that I found interesting was that there were over 300 pages of text messages between Scott and Jazelle alone in regard to Michelle. So, the prosecutor listened to the recordings of Scott and Jazelle's conversations. He read over all those pages of text messages as part of his investigation, and he concluded that Jazelle had hated her former best friend for at least 6 years. According to what he could put together from all of the evidence, a senior computer forensic examiner employed by the FBI recovered all of the data from a hard drive on one of Jazelle's computers. She had conducted over 300 searches on the internet for the name Michelle Lay. Other searches included: is there a certain chemical that can induce a heart attack without leaving a trace? How to find someone who doesn't want to be found? How to follow someone without getting caught? How to induce a heart attack, and where to buy potassium chloride? Clearly, this was completely premeditated. 2 psychiatric evaluations had been done. They were filed in that custody dispute between Scott and Jazelle, and they stated that she had a history of depression. They included details about an incident when she was in her 20s. Her friend said that they called 911 after they found her asleep near an empty bottle of antidepressants. But Jazelle denied overdosing. Both of these psychiatric evaluations were done in the summer of 2010, and they found that she was not a danger to herself or others. This was around the same time that that meeting was facilitated between her, the therapist, Michelle, and Scott. However, Scott relayed to the prosecutor that in the months leading up to the murder, Jazelle took out a knife and threatened to use it on herself and her unborn child, which she claimed was his if he didn't leave Michelle alone. Jazelle was indeed pregnant. That was not a lie. She actually gave birth the week before Thanksgiving in 2011, following her arrest. She had a son, but it was not Scott's child. Scott was made aware of this, and that's how they know when Jazelle gave birth. The child was put into the father's custody, and both Jazelle and her attorney were very careful not to provide any information about her son's identity. The opening arguments began on October 1, 2012, and prosecutor Butch Ford presented the case to the jury as a devastating case of premeditated murder. He said Jazelle had a motive, her life was in shambles, she lost custody of her daughter, and out of jealousy, Jazelle wanted to murder her beautiful, smart, loving friend Michelle, out of revenge for her belief that Michelle had broken up her family. Jazelle's attorney acknowledged that Jazelle indeed killed Michelle, but she argued it was not murder, it was voluntary manslaughter, not first-degree murder, not premeditated. She claimed it was Michelle's own fault that she was killed, because she provoked Jazelle into committing the killing in a heat of passion. Come on, there's so much evidence here, so much planning, so much calculation, and that is what the prosecutor was able to show. There were recordings of Jazelle laughing while talking about wanting to kill people. And then she actually did. But Jazelle's attorney wanted the jury to convict her of manslaughter because she was bipolar and not taking her medication at the time of the murder. Her attorney stated that Jazelle's texts proved she had a fragile mental state, that she was paranoid and in psychosis, and that put her over the edge. According to Jazelle, after a conversation with Michelle in that garage, Michelle provoked her, and Jazelle killed her former best friend because she snapped in a moment of rage. The defense attorney even went on to allege that Michelle was a lying schemer and robbed Jazelle of her family. It was unsettling, to say the least, for Michelle's family to hear her being blamed for her own murder. She did nothing to deserve what happened to her, and many of her family members had to leave the courtroom, especially during the texts that were being read out loud, the vile things being said about the person they loved. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and after 4 days of the jury deliberating, the prosecutor and Michelle's family were getting nervous. They were beginning to wonder if the jury felt sympathy for Jazelle because she was a pregnant mom. Even more classically, they were stunned that the jury was taking so long to return a verdict, because in a lot of people's minds, the evidence pointed straight to Jazelle. By the 5th day, the jury of 6 men and 6 women finally reached a verdict. Michelle's loved ones were holding hands in the front row as the jury entered that courtroom. The verdict: Jazelle Esteban was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She is eligible for parole in 2029, which is coming up before we know it. The judge said that he had never seen a case with more compelling circumstantial evidence pointing straight to the killer. Today's case, I want to introduce you to Wendy Ann Twice. She was born on June 25, 1952, into a well-to-do family in the suburbs of Connecticut on the New England coast. Wendy's parents were both teachers, and they were able to provide everything she needed or wanted. However, although she lived a pretty privileged middle-class life, Wendy was always yearning for something more. People close to her described her as a wannabe flower child, essentially a hippie and an overall lover of the 60s. She was a bit of a rebellious teenager. She would stay out late at night, and sometimes she wouldn't even come home at all. She was also experimenting with drugs. When Wendy was only 17 years old, she left high school, and that is when her life started to spiral out of control. She ended up vanishing. Her family searched for her everywhere. It was terrifying knowing that she could be all alone, or worse, injured, or even dead. Soon, her family would understand her familiar, yet very peculiar and unsettling patterns. When Wendy's parents finally found her, she was living in a tent in New Hampshire, and they could tell that she wasn't acting like herself. She was out of control, unstable, and they feared that she could end up in an even worse situation. So, as hard as it was, they decided to admit her to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors believed that she may have been suffering from drug-induced bipolar disorder. There was this pattern of mental health issues that plagued Wendy. Her family witnessed this for a while. Wendy had displayed symptoms like those of bipolar disorder throughout her entire life, but they seemed to have gotten much worse. One clue that something was definitely wrong was that Wendy began writing bizarre letters to herself and her family. Her family would try to decipher what these letters meant, but they were confusing. It was almost as though they were written by somebody else. They knew that Wendy authored them because she was alone. They couldn't have been written by anyone else. That's kind of scary, right? I'd be thinking, wow, this person may be out of their mind in one way or another, but you care about them. You only want the best. But if you're not a professional and only a loved one, what can you do? The letters themselves didn't even make sense to the family. Even more concerning and confusing was the fact that she began signing them with another name. I'm intrigued by her, truly. I'm sure there was a lot of judgment set forth against Wendy. It's hard not to judge things that we don't understand or experience in our own lives, but I ask you to be open-minded and sensitive to the fact that we all have flaws. We're all dealing with our own demons, so to speak. Wendy's just happened to have a name, Shauna. It's important for me to introduce you to Shauna Wendy's alter ego or possible dual personality. Shauna was the real wild child. But before I really dive into all that, let me tell you what was happening in Wendy's life by the time she turned 18. She was still living at the facility that her parents had checked her into. However, once she turned 18, she was able to make her own decisions. She decided to refuse any further treatment. She checked herself out and disappeared from her family once again. She didn't keep in contact with her family at all. No phone calls, no letters, no sign that she was safe or okay. It's typical for individuals suffering from certain types of mental health conditions to refuse therapy or medication because they don't think they have anything wrong with them. Their world is familiar to them, whereas the people around them can see this profound difference between what we generally see as normal and what is not. Wendy wandered around, doing her own thing in her own world, or probably in both her and Shauna's world, for a couple of years. About 2 years later, Wendy showed back up at her parents' house in Connecticut, telling them that she had been trying to escape an abusive relationship. This homecoming didn't last very long. In a very short time, she was gone once again, and this time for much longer. Actually, her family didn't see or hear from her until she was 25 years old, in 1978. To make ends meet, Wendy was working as a hotel maid in Reno. She had moved there to try to escape this ex who had been treating her badly. It isn't clear whether this is the same ex she was running from when she returned to her family, but this boyfriend ended up finding her in Reno. He was stalking her, and on one particular day, this ex-boyfriend became enraged. He was following her around and then pushed her into an alley and proceeded to beat her up. This is where Denny Rite comes into the picture, Wendy's knight in shining armor. Denny protected Wendy, he scared off the ex-boyfriend, and in her mind, he saved her life. Denny was from Hearst in northern Ontario. He was the opposite of Wendy. His upbringing was quite different. His family wasn't well off, and while Wendy grew up being raised by 2 teachers, Denny couldn't read or write. He was in the mining industry, working the gold and copper mines. This was hard labor, it was grueling work, and he would travel to places like Las Vegas during his off time to relax and do one of his favorite things, gambling. I found that interesting because his day job was trying to strike gold, while his R&R was trying to hit the jackpot. Denny prided himself on his poker-playing abilities, and he won quite frequently. So you see, he may not have been able to read books, but he knew how to read people, which helped him know when to hold or fold. Maybe his knack for reading people helped him read Wendy that day, because when he stepped in to help her, the moment she set eyes on him for the very first time, they both said that they knew they were meant to be together. However, there was a language barrier. He spoke French, and he knew very little English. Needless to say, they had a hard time communicating, but that didn't stop them from taking a chance on each other. When it came time for Denny to leave Reno, Wendy told him she wanted to go with him. Please take her along. It wasn't long before the couple decided that they wanted to get married. Wendy wanted her family to be involved, so she took Denny back home to meet them. They were actually ecstatic to see that she'd found someone to possibly help her be reined in and to settle down. They were amazed at the story of him coming to her rescue. The two had a small wedding in Connecticut, and they both looked amazing. Friends described Denny as looking like a guy from Saturday Night Fever and Wendy as looking like a hippie Pocahontas. I can see it. Once they were hitched, the couple moved back to Denny's home in northern Canada. This is where he had a job in Uranium City, working in the mines. Even though his job was physically taxing on Denny, he liked having that steady income. The first couple of years of their marriage were great. They were so happy, and everyone around them could tell they were in love. Wendy and Denny ended up having 2 children, Gabriel and Anna. At this point, they decided it was time to pack up and move on. Wendy enrolled at the University of Saskatchewan and was working towards getting her teaching degree, just like her parents. Denny found a job in a hospital as a janitor. The Rites spent a lot of time together whenever they could. They would go on trips as a family, pick berries, garden, and play board and card games. They were described as the perfect little family. Anna was definitely a daddy's girl, and Denny became her rock. He was calm and patient. He would rather take a walk in the woods by himself than go to a social event. He was also extremely protective of Wendy and his children. He loved them so much. Gabriel, on the other hand, was closer to Wendy. She was very nurturing as a mother, and she wanted Anna and Gabriel to have emotional stability in their lives, which was something that she'd always struggled with. She loved her job, working with children. She wanted to teach children how to help themselves, how to speak up and be heard. She even organized a peace project at one point, where she taught students about conflict resolution and respect. After Wendy received her teaching degree, the Rite family bought a property in rural British Columbia, right outside of Prince George. Denny found a job in McBride, also in British Columbia, working in a lumber mill. Wendy found work as a substitute teacher at the local high school, where she was counseling unemployed individuals. Her experience was about to come in handy because Denny was about to lose his job. Things had not been going well for a while. Ever since Wendy became the breadwinner of the family, the balance of power shifted. Denny began to harbor resentment towards Wendy. He wasn't making a steady paycheck anymore, and he wasn't enjoying his work. Wendy, on the other hand, saw no limits on what she could do. Growing up, she was immersed in music, theater, and art, so she was into all kinds of things, from natural healing remedies using herbs to living off the land. Wendy was always a free spirit, trying to find world peace. She had always been a dreamer, spending a lot of time in her head, with a wild imagination. One could say she wasn't very well grounded, no matter how stable her life seemed. She was always jumping from one trend to the next. One day she would be telling her friends and family that she was a vegan or no longer consuming dairy products, and then the next week she was trying some kind of new vitamin regimen or routine. But that's not all. Some of the things Wendy was into went beyond the norm. She believed in the supernatural. She believed she could call upon ghosts and summon them. This is also when she summoned Shauna. Remember Shauna, Wendy's alter ego? Wendy would call her children to come around the table, and she would have them hold hands and participate in seances. This is how Wendy would turn into Shauna. It was as if the spirit would come into her body, and when this happened, she would take on a completely different personality. She did not seem to want to be Wendy. She didn't seem to want Wendy's life. She didn't want kids or a husband. She wanted to escape and be free. This must have been very hard to comprehend as a child. Denny was so patient and so kind to her because he loved Wendy so much. He was the one who could handle her, talk her down, and bring her back from Shauna to Wendy again and again. When this shift happened, he would calmly take her away, remove her from the seance, put her in a quiet bedroom, and talk to her for hours until she would come back to Earth. Since she refused to seek help or get on medication, this was the only method that seemed to work for her, and Denny obliged. But no matter how many times he would try to help her, Shauna would come back. Soon, Denny was the one who was going to need help from Wendy. He was about to have a life-changing event. While he was at work one day in 1995, he got injured. He slipped on a deck that was wet from the snow, and a log hit his shoulder, causing him to be knocked unconscious. No one was there to see exactly what happened, but because of this accident, Denny was left with nerve damage down the right side of his body and severe back pain, which only got worse with time. Although he tried to return to work, he just couldn't perform the same physical activities in this demanding job that he once did. To his credit, Denny did try to find other jobs, but he was 45 years old, did not know how to read or write, and could no longer perform physically demanding work, so there were not many options left for him. Denny applied for workers' compensation, and it was now up to Wendy, and Wendy alone, to provide for their family. It's sad because Denny felt lost. He was 45 years old, without a career, no real purpose, nothing to do but sit at home feeling as though he couldn't contribute like he used to, and that can definitely wear on your self-esteem. However, Wendy and Denny loved each other. They would still look at each other with these loving eyes, and they never even fought. Even though Wendy was a very passionate person, when she believed in something, she would fight for it. She believed in being peaceful and loving, even through tough times. Wendy told the family that they were going to be just fine, that they were going to make this work and be together forever. But it was less than a month later when their life would be ripped apart. On August 18, 1997, Denny and Wendy headed out the door. They told their son Gabriel, who was standing in the kitchen, that they were going to run some errands after lunch. The phone rang at home, and Anna answered it. It was her father, and he was calling to ask if she or Gabriel had heard from Wendy. Anna said, "No, we haven't." He told Anna that Wendy had dropped him off before picking up a few things she needed from downtown, and then she was supposed to go tutor a student, meet up with a friend of hers, and come back to pick him up at the hardware store around 1:30. But she never showed up. Anna told her father that she had not heard anything from her mother, and as soon as they got off the phone, she began making phone calls. She called the police, and they just told her that Wendy could not be reported missing until she had been gone for over 24 hours. So instead, she called up the friend that Wendy was supposed to be with, and then she called up the girl that she was supposed to tutor, and they let her know that Wendy hadn't shown up to either place. Wendy was not the type of person to show up late or not at all when she had plans, so it was definitely not like her to miss these appointments, especially the tutoring lesson, because she took her job very seriously. This made Anna increasingly concerned. The family continued to wait all evening, staring at the door, anticipating Wendy just walking back through it at any time. As it started to get darker out, Denny decided to go back into town with Anna in the family's old truck to look for her. When Wendy and Denny would normally go into town, they would go to a coffee shop or Tim Hortons, so Denny decided to drive to those places to see if she was there. It was at that time that Anna looked over and saw the family's white Plymouth Voyager parked under a streetlight in a nearby grocery store parking lot. She noticed it looked like the grocery store was just closing up, so she ran in, hoping that maybe she would catch her mom inside. However, the doors were already closed, and when she knocked, they told her that there were no customers inside. Anna and her dad went back and they examined the van. That's when they noticed there was a dent in the side that they didn't think had been there before. That was interesting because they thought this might have been foul play. Someone could have taken her, there could have been a struggle, and the dent was made in the car when they took her away. But there was just no sign of anything like that. There was nothing around except for that dent that would make them believe anything like that happened. Denny had a spare key, and they did not notice anything different on the inside of the van, so they ended up deciding to have Anna drive the van home. When they got home, Anna continued to make calls. She called all of her friends, all of Wendy's friends, and eventually everyone in Wendy's entire directory, but not one single person had seen or heard from her. The next day, the Retays reported Wendy missing with the RCMP, that's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They created a missing persons poster that they could hang around town. It had a picture of Wendy along with information to describe her, and it read, "Last seen in the area of 15th and Spruce Street, Prince George, on Monday, August 18th, 1997. It continued with, "Wendy is a Caucasian 44-year-old woman, 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighing 155 pounds, with brown hair, hazel eyes, and wears glasses. When she was last seen, she was wearing a blue-green blouse, blue jeans, and carrying a purse." Anna spent the next week diligently putting up the missing persons posters. The waiting was hard on everyone, especially Denny. He could not sit still, he just couldn't do much of anything. He would frequently take these long walks in the woods, and Anna eventually saw him break down and get emotional for the first time during this time. The longer that Wendy stayed missing, the bigger the news became around Prince George, and the more people learned of this case, the more speculations came about where she could be or what had possibly happened to her. Early on in the investigation, police focused on Denny, which isn't surprising to most people, including his own sister, who told him that he needed to get used to all the attention because, according to her, 99% of the time, the husband is the one who did it. His sister discouraged him when police asked him to take a lie detector test, but he agreed to take one anyway. Detective Judy Thomas, the lead investigator into Wendy's disappearance, said that Denny was nervous when he came in to take the test, but he wasn't more nervous than most people are. It's just that nobody knows exactly how to take a polygraph test or how they work. The polygraph operator asked Denny directly if he had anything to do with Wendy's disappearance, and he said, "No, I did not." The results showed that Denny had not been deceptive when he was answering the question, and he was eliminated as a suspect. There still weren't any real leads in this case, so what happened to Wendy? Detective Thomas then decided that she needed to focus her sights on the other major theories and rumors that had been floating around Prince George. Highway 16, more commonly known as the Highway of Tears, is a highway that extends about 450 miles between Prince Rupert and Prince George, British Columbia. When Wendy went missing, that August of 1997, 15 women had either gone missing or had been found dead along that highway. People suspected that there may have been a serial killer in the area, and because Wendy's van was found relatively close to that highway, Speculation began to stir about whether or not these cases were related, and that she could have been another one of these victims. Detective Thomas looked into this lead, of course, but only briefly. That was because Wendy did not fit the demographic of the many other individuals who had gone missing or been found along the highway. Many of these women were young, in their 20s, and were either hitchhikers involved in drugs or organized crime, or they were sex workers. Wendy just did not fit into that mold. Another theory that Detective Thomas looked into was the possibility that perhaps Wendy's wandering spirit had taken back over her, and maybe she ran away from her family. Her sister Karen said that it wouldn't have surprised her if Wendy just up and left her husband and children, because she had left her family once before when she was younger. She said that Wendy just couldn't comprehend how doing these things hurt the people that loved her. The Greyhound bus station was only a couple of blocks from the grocery store where her family found her van. Gabriel went down there, put up one of the missing persons posters of Wendy, and then asked a woman working there if she had recognized Wendy. The woman actually told Gabriel that she did, and in fact, she was certain that she had seen Wendy sitting at a table at the bus station. This was the type of lead they needed at this time. It's also the story that Wendy's family believed was true, that Wendy took off because she wanted to vanish, she wanted freedom, she wanted to be Shauna more than Wendy, especially because her episodes had been getting worse over the years. They were harder to control without medication or therapy. Denny was finding it so hard to deal with these mood swings and the personality switches. I feel like it's hard to keep one relationship together and to have to work with two dueling personalities, and not being able to get through to the person you love would be very frustrating. Wendy was kind, she was patient, compassionate, and loving. Shauna was not. Shauna was the opposite of all of those things. Her personality seemed to become darker and darker over time. Wendy's family just assumed that she vanished once again of her own volition. She had done it to her family growing up, so why not her family now? She had left everyone behind when she was 17. Therefore, they believed she could 100% leave her husband and children behind, without a doubt. But why? Why would her own family feel so strongly about this? It was because she so easily took herself out of her family's lives when she was growing up, which really left a mark on them, especially her older sister Karen. Karen wanted to protect her, and nobody felt like they could do anything. Wendy left all the people that loved her and cared about her, even all the people she called friends. With this track record in mind, they believed that she would have no problem leaving everyone behind again. But there were other reasons why people who knew her best thought this could be true. Anna began looking through her mom's papers. She was looking for some kind of sign or clue about where her mom might be or what could have happened. That's when she ended up finding an application for a teaching position in California. This definitely surprised her. Her mother had never told her or anyone else about applying for this position, and after all, Anna was from the United States, not from Canada. Maybe she truly did want to start over. Detective Thomas, when searching the family's home early in the disappearance, also found Wendy's passport was missing. Her family knew that she had also been involved in this religious group at one point, and this group called themselves the Emissaries of Divine Light. Sounds right up her alley with the spirituality and everything. Wendy was always bouncing from different religions, and she was just searching for her place to belong. She could have possibly been discontent because of her duality. This church group also had several branches in the United States, which continued to play into this theory that perhaps she left her family in search of something else, maybe a way that she could be more of Shauna and less of Wendy. I couldn't find any information about Wendy's early childhood other than what I already told you. She grew up in a middle-class family with two parents who were teachers. But it does make me think about it because 90% of people who suffer from this condition dealt with childhood trauma, and there are so many things that can be considered trauma to us that wouldn't necessarily look traumatic to someone else. Wendy had already been running away from home as a teenager, so there must have been something or someone that she was running from. If it was that easy for her to leave her parents, doesn't it make you think that she wasn't happy being with them? I could be totally wrong, I'm assuming here. But what about the fact that they put her away in an institution instead of being patient with her the way Denny was? I understand that many of us are not equipped to handle disorders, and sometimes it's safer and better to leave that care up to someone professional. However, It was just a perspective that I explored, considering that she was suffering from having these two personalities. Whether we understand it or not, having split personalities is a real thing. What's scary is that the alternate personality can take over a person's mind, at least for a temporary amount of time. The original personality, or the host personality, is still there, but it begins to take more of a passive role, more of a backseat driver, letting the alternate personality take control. Get this, the host may not even be aware that the other personality exists in them, which makes it very difficult for them to get treatment, and that terrifies me. But I also found it interesting, and it could be connected to what might have happened to Wendy. When this personality shifts, the new personality has its own identity, completely separate from the host. This means that Shauna would have her own history, her own age, mood, memories, vocabulary, behavior, and even a different belief system. Shauna may not have even liked Wendy's husband, her children, or her lifestyle, so it's really not that hard to believe that Shauna could have been slowly taking over, which finally led Wendy to be forced to leave so that Shauna could live out her own dreams. In the past couple of years before her disappearance, Denny had seen darker sides to Shauna, and there were things that made him very uncomfortable. Shauna would talk about how she wanted to take people's spirits from them. She would discuss sexual acts and other things that he did not think were appropriate. Yet Denny still tried to be patient with Wendy, because he knew she wasn't purposely exposing Shauna's perversions. After all, Wendy and Denny had been together for almost 2 decades at this time. Anna was only 17, yet she was one of the most dedicated family members looking for her mother. She wouldn't stop checking in with detectives and doing her own investigating. Meanwhile, Detective Thomas looked into all of these factors to see if Wendy had just left on her own accord. She spoke to the woman Gabriel had mentioned, but this time, the woman claimed that she couldn't say whether it was Wendy she had seen at the bus station. Detectives also flagged bank accounts, credit cards, and social security numbers, and they put Wendy on a Canada-wide database. They checked airlines and border crossings, but they found nothing. Detective Thomas looked into that religious group and its branches, but once again, they found nothing. The detective wanted to get a better understanding of Wendy, so she interviewed some of the people who knew Wendy best. She interviewed Wendy's mother, asking about her teenage years and the times she had run away. She also interviewed some of Wendy's closest friends. After speaking with these individuals, Detective Thomas concluded that she didn't think Wendy would leave her family because her friends would say over and over again that Wendy was, first and foremost, a mother, and she would never have left her children behind. Detective Thomas also emphasized that there was something very different about a rebellious teen running away from her family than a grown woman with a family, a husband, and children just leaving everything behind. The last major theory that Detective Thomas had to look into was the most talked about and perhaps the most credible of all the theories: the Jones family. The Jones family were neighbors of the Rites, and just 4 months before Wendy's disappearance, she had complained about them publicly in a local newspaper. Yeah, she went off and claimed that the Joneses had been mistreating their animals and that they had basically used their land as a garbage dump. The family was kicked off their property and they had their animals taken from them. That's a lot to handle, and who knows what that would cause someone to do. It had been alleged that the Joneses had made threats to the Rites, and at one point, the wife of the Jones family sent a letter to the local paper talking trash about Wendy and the Rites. She purposely spelled the name Rite as rat, so instead of R-A-T-T-E-S, she called them the Rats, R-A-T-S. Kind of childish, but still. Gabriel also stated that his mother had felt threatened by the Joneses, and that they would shout and scream at Wendy whenever they passed by. So this was not a good relationship. Detective Thomas looked into this theory, as she had with every other, and there had been one particular member of the Jones family who was speculated to be the one who may have done something to Wendy. However, this individual wasn't even around the area anymore, and there was nothing else that detectives could find to support the theory. These detectives, especially Detective Thomas, were just at a loss at this point. Every theory couldn't be substantiated, and the case essentially seemed to come to a dead end. Gabriel, Anna, and Denny had to try to go on with their lives. 3 years after Wendy disappeared, Gabriel moved to Vancouver and enrolled in college. Keeping busy helped him deal with the pain, but he wasn't able to fully get over his mom's disappearance, and one day in class, Gabriel had a mental breakdown. It was terrible, and he ended up quitting school. Anna was living with her boyfriend, hundreds of miles away from Prince George, but she still kept in contact with detectives because she was determined to keep her mother's case alive. Denny went about his own life as well. However, he seemed to be struggling the most. He lost everything: his beautiful, loving wife, his partner, the person he loved the most. She was also his support system, and without her, he had no way to live financially. She was the backbone of the family. Now his kids were growing up and they were gone too. He really didn't have a traditional way to make ends meet. So, sadly, like many other people who are desperate in these situations, he turned to crime. He was desperate for money. This included drug dealing, which eventually got Denny arrested. Luckily for him, he only received probation, since it was his first offense. Unfortunately, he lost the family home and had no other choice but to live in a cheap apartment in a bad part of town. He was collecting bottles just to be able to eat. When Anna spoke to her dad on the phone or got a chance to see him, she could tell he had changed entirely. He went from being a calm, patient, steady man to an angry, emotional mess. Initially, she thought it was grief over Wendy's disappearance that caused this change, everything he had been through. But then a different thought came to her mind. Maybe it wasn't grief that her father was suffering from. Maybe it was guilt. She had an overwhelming gut feeling that he was hiding something. While diligently working to find answers about her mother's disappearance, Anna uncovered another side to the perfect family she once believed she had. However, she couldn't give much time to this discovery at the moment because, through all the sadness, there was some light in her life. In 2002, she was marrying her longtime boyfriend, Eric. It was hard for Anna to walk down the aisle in her beautiful dress and not see her mother smiling back at her. She knew she had to hold it together on her special day. The day was as difficult as it was special, particularly because of Denny's attitude. You would imagine this being one of the happiest days of his life, watching his only daughter get married to the man she loved. But he wasn't impressed. He wasn't keen on the fact that Eric was 16 years older than Anna. He thought they were mismatched, and he was completely detached during the wedding until a song came on. The song Anna picked for her first dance was her parents' song, which upset Denny deeply. He became so emotional that he just wanted to leave. This reaction is understandable in some ways. It's his daughter's wedding, and she chooses a song that reminds him of his missing wife. While it was a special choice for Anna, it brought up a lot of unresolved emotions for Denny. Anna let it slide, understanding that emotions were running high. This was the first happy get-together since Wendy had gone missing, and it was as though the family had forgotten how to be happy. But they tried. 5 years later, however, Anna's perspective shifted. On the 10th anniversary of Wendy's disappearance, Anna decided to dig deeper and act on her suspicions about her father. As Anna asked family and friends about Denny, she discovered that he had become bitter when the family moved. This bitterness stemmed from having to leave his job as a miner, a job that was the best-paying one he ever had and ever would have. He truly resented the fact that he had to leave. You may have forgotten about Denny's first love, gambling. It's what brought him and Wendy together in the first place. Well, even though he was no longer working at the mines, he didn't stop gambling, and it became more of a burden on his family than just a fun pastime. He wasn't a young, carefree guy hanging out in Reno anymore. He had children and responsibilities. Wendy, who had been working hard to keep everything together and prevent the family from falling apart, didn't care about his gambling at first. She even tried to set limits with him, telling him that he needed to be smart and avoid playing big money or taking big risks on poker games. Especially because, after Denny got hurt, they no longer had any extra money that they could afford to lose. But Denny felt he was good enough to hit it big and wanted to contribute financially again. This meant he had to risk a lot of money that the family couldn't afford to lose. Even though Wendy was known as a very loving, patient person, she became angry at one point when she found out that Denny had secretly put away $500 for gambling. Another time, after he'd been hurt and out of work, Denny gambled and went all in on a full house, only to lose nearly $10,000. Despite these incidents, Denny continued gambling. Even after Wendy gave him several $100s to get some dental work done, he never ended up getting it. Anna had also given him money at one point for him and Wendy's anniversary to help them go out and celebrate, but he never did anything. Both times, they found out that he gambled the money away. Wendy, feeling overwhelmed, confided in close friends and family about Denny's gambling addiction. She admitted that she had been considering leaving him. She even told them she had brought up a conversation with Denny about possibly having an open relationship and that she was considering a sexual relationship with a woman. This was something that Shauna had actually brought up when Wendy was having an episode, so this technically wasn't Wendy's idea. However, she still brought it up to Danae, and I don't know how that made him feel. Wendy was already having trouble taking care of herself, and more of her struggles started to be uncovered when detectives looked further into her disappearance. Anna told him that when she was growing up, she noticed her mom would have these mood swings. Some days she would be really happy, and then other days it seemed as though her world was completely falling apart. In reality, it was something much bigger, and we know that Anna did not know anything about Wendy's alter ego because Danae shielded his children from the truth. Danae's sister spoke about these mood swings of Wendy's, and she said that she first noticed them when Anna and Gabriel were children. She said that one moment, Wendy would be extremely gentle and soft-spoken with her children, and then only minutes later, she would be cold and abrupt with them. Danae would notice the shift in Wendy almost immediately, so he helped Wendy hide it. Whenever he took her away to another room or out of the house, away from everyone, she would come back and be completely normal. Danae's family eventually asked him what was going on with Wendy, and that's when he finally told them that it wasn't Wendy, it was Shauna. Danae said that Wendy told him about Shauna not long after the two had gotten married, so he had known all along, but not until they got married. So that's interesting. It's almost like don't let him know until you lock him down. But he wasn't the only person that had known about this other side of Wendy. Wendy's sister, Karen, said she had met Shauna in the past as well. Karen said she was supposed to meet up with Wendy one day, and when Wendy showed up, she was not herself at all. She showed up in this expensive car, bragging about how much money she was making, and she wasn't interested in anything about Wendy. Karen claims that it was at that point that Wendy told her she was no longer Wendy anymore. She claimed she was Shauna and that she was magical. She described Shauna as this ancient spirit called Doshana. Danae's sister said that Wendy refused to get help with these issues, and just a month before her disappearance, she had left and taken the kids to visit an old friend of hers named Lois. Of course, they tracked down Lois, and Lois said that while Wendy was there, she confided in her. Wendy told her about Danae's struggle to find a job, as well as his gambling addiction, and how it was really hard on her. She also told her about leaving him, and she said she knew she had to make that decision about whether or not she was going to stay with him. She also started to be more vocal with her children about leaving their father. She told Anna that she loved Danae, but she was angry with him, and that she wasn't sure she would ever be able to forgive him. She also told Anna that Danae's addiction was ruining them. Wendy decided to go as far as changing the bank accounts into her name because she felt like Danae wasn't able to control himself and wouldn't be able to protect the family's money. When Wendy went back home, she did sit down and have a heart-to-heart conversation with Danae. She later called Lois and told her that their conversation went well and that they were going to give it another try. But she emphasized that this was the last time, this was the last chance she was going to give him. Lois said that Wendy sounded relieved and extremely happy on the phone. Anna said that Danae had been bothered by what Wendy told him, especially the way that she had told other people about their marriage issues and Danae's gambling issues. Anna knew that her father was a proud man, and it bothered him that his dirty laundry had essentially been aired to so many people. When Danae was questioned by police, however, he maintained that his marriage was back on track and that everything was good. However, she did go missing the same exact day he received his final rejection notice on his worker compensation claim. I was thinking perhaps Wendy was at her breaking point. Maybe she didn't want to take responsibility for all this. Maybe this is what triggered Shauna to appear, and maybe she really did leave on her own to start a new life. In her mind, her family could have been better without her. However, detectives had always had another suspicion about Danae from the beginning. They thought he could be involved. Detective Thomas had interviewed him 3 times in the first few days after Wendy's disappearance. When she did, she noticed that his answers would change, especially when it came to vital facts in the case. Originally, when he was interviewed by detectives, Danae told them that Wendy had no money whenever she dropped him off and left that day. But then, in a follow-up statement, he claimed that he had given her more than $2,000. Detectives also said that Danae never seemed overly concerned or distraught about Wendy's disappearance, even in the early days. However, you've probably heard this before. Everybody grieves differently. About a month into the disappearance, Danae had also been caught on a bank surveillance camera cashing unemployment checks of Wendy's at an ATM. But he'd been honest with detectives about this. He told them that their family didn't have any money coming in since Wendy was gone. He needed money from those checks in order to pay the bills. But all of this information was dismissed once Danae passed the polygraph and when the other theories were starting to be investigated. Plus, it made perfect sense. They were married. It's not as though he was stealing a stranger's money. He truly wasn't able to go on without that assistance. Even if it wasn't legal or wasn't the right thing to do, he was that desperate. As the years passed, Anna stayed focused on the case, making sure that others did as well. She did not want the police or the public to forget about this case. She went out of her way to make sure they didn't. At one point, she went to Frank Peebles, a reporter from the Prince George Citizen. He had been covering this case from the beginning. She came in with a folder of newspaper clippings and potential leads in her mother's case. She sat down and told Frank that she felt as though her father was probably involved in whatever happened to her mother. Anna had gone to Danae one day after detectives had told her that he kept changing his story. She asked him exactly what he had done that day, trying to get a timeline from him. Not only was he not willing to give it to her, but he got angry and told her he wasn't talking about Wendy's disappearance anymore. If she needed to know what his timeline of events was for that day, she could just go ask the police. This could look suspicious, but it could also truly be frustrating. They hadn't even found a body this entire time, so it really did look as though she ran off. If that was the case, it wouldn't be wrong for a husband to be angry, as much as he may want her back. Even though Anna felt as if the case had been cold, investigators had actually been putting a lot of work behind the scenes. They had the same suspicion as Anna that her dad, Danae, had been responsible for her mother's disappearance, or maybe they just wanted to solve the case and truly had no other leads. In 2007, Detective Thomas decided to pass the case off to the Unsolved Homicide Unit, which she felt could potentially do more with Wendy's case. Ron Barrett was now in charge of the case. He had been the lead investigator of the Unsolved Homicide Unit. He too felt that Danae was responsible for whatever happened to Wendy. He thought he had a way he could prove it, a sting operation that they called Mr. Big. The Unsolved Homicide Unit was used to coming up with these elaborate undercover operations. They had actually completed 350 of them, where they would create a fake criminal organization from scratch and have officers pose as criminals. Remember, Danae is a desperate man who has already been caught up in crime to survive. In June 2008, an undercover officer met with Danae and Prince George. He told him that he was looking for someone to help him with a job, but he didn't know his way around town. Danae, without question, agreed to help him. A week later, this same officer asked Danae if he wanted to make some extra money delivering bags with unknown contents in them, and Danae agreed. In no time, he was a fully functioning member of what he believed was a criminal gang. He thought he was helping to smuggle illegal cigarettes and alcohol, exchange stolen diamonds, and transport guns. Do you blame him? The man can't read or write. He lost his wife, his kids are gone, and his daughter thinks he's responsible for their mother's disappearance. Life was tough. I really think he didn't believe he had anything to lose, and at least money to gain. He even went as far as threatening a man at one point, and standing his ground at a hotel door, while he believed that the gang members were brutally beating a woman on the inside. He made about $12,000 in a few months that he had been involved in this group, which was actually undercover cops, and this made him proud of himself again. Parts of the old Danae started to show up. Gabriel said that around this time, his dad visited him in Vancouver, and it was as though his dad was back. The old Danae was back. But little did Gabriel know that his dad was only in Vancouver to make what he believed to be an illegal delivery, and that it was his criminal group that had brought this old Danae back. 3 months into this undercover operation, Danae was right where detectives wanted him to be, and they were ready to get the actual police involved again. Detectives contacted Danae and told him that the investigation into Wendy's disappearance had been reopened and that he was the prime suspect. This was part of the ruse because they wanted him to feel afraid that something was going to happen to him. They had to force him toward the criminals in the gang to assist him in getting away, or to help prove he didn't do anything. They also informed him that all those years ago, he had actually failed that polygraph test. This was a little suspicious to me, personally. Polygraphs aren't reliable as it is, but to kind of bait and switch him like that irked me. It was fine enough back then when he first took the polygraph for police to give up and move on to other potential theories. But now that they don't have anything to run with after all these years, it turns out he actually failed the polygraph back then. With no one else to turn to, Dene turned to the only people he had, the undercover officers that he believed to be his criminal friends. He hoped that they would know how to help him or know someone who could. This is when they told him about Mr. Big, the fake gang leader of this criminal organization who apparently called all the shots. Mr. Big supposedly was known for being able to make your criminal problems disappear, but only if he liked you and wanted you to become an official member of their organization. So if he liked you, number one, and if he wanted you to become part of this criminal organization, then he would help you. Keep that in mind. The main things they made sure to tell Dene about Mr. Big, however, was that you had to be honest with him. Up until that point, Dene had repeated the same story over and over again. He'd been repeating it for decades to the undercover officers whenever they asked him about Wendy. But they hoped that when he faced Mr. Big, he would tell them the truth that he was really responsible for what happened to Wendy. They didn't want to just prove that Dene had been responsible for what happened to Wendy, but they also wanted to find the truth. If he was irresponsible, I really think he was caught between a rock and a hard place, and the police had put him there. He was completely desperate, at the mercy of this fake criminal organization, and he knew the story that he had been giving them up until this point wasn't getting him anywhere. It definitely wasn't getting him out of trouble or out of being a prime suspect. So on September 27, 2008, Rob Barrett sat in a hotel room, monitoring a video feed from a nearby room where Dene was meeting with who he believed was Mr. Big. Early into the conversation, something different happened. Mr. Big told Dene that he would have to come clean about his past and about his wife's disappearance, and if he had known anything about it or had been involved in any way, because that was the only way he was going to help him and possibly want him to be a part of this gang. Right now, this is when Dene, after 11 years of repeating almost the exact same story, switched things up completely. Why? Well, there could be two reasons. One, he so badly wanted to be part of this family, the family of this gang. But it is a family, and he didn't have one right now, so that could be one reason. Maybe he thought by looking more like a heartless criminal, this would build rapport. Or was it that he was about to drop a bombshell, the real truth? Dene told Mr. Big that he had never told anyone what he was about to tell him, that he was responsible for Wendy's disappearance, but not only that, her death. He told him that he hadn't been proud of what he did, but he was the one that did it. He said that everything had gone so perfectly, just as he planned. He had a rifle and he fired one shot toward the back of her head, and then he began to further elaborate on what he did. He told Mr. Big that when they went to leave that morning, Wendy stopped to feed the ducks, and that's when her back was toward him. He took out his .22 caliber, aimed, and fired. It appeared to all these undercover officers that 11 years' worth of secrets were beginning to spill right out of Dene's mouth. As he continued to talk to Mr. Big, he told him that there hadn't been a lot of blood and that after this, she fell to the ground, and he quickly wrapped her body in a black tarp. But wouldn't there be a lot of, I don't know, you tell me, because I'm working on another case where I'm looking at crime scene evidence, and a head wound can definitely produce a lot of blood. But let's move on. He said he noticed that Wendy was still moving. That's when he took a tire iron and said he finished her off. He continued telling Mr. Big that he put Wendy in her van. He made a left turn onto Highway 16 and drove to an abandoned loggers road about an hour and a half away, and that's where he put her body into a swamp. Well, you know the cops want more, so they needed to see exactly where all of this took place in order to believe this story. Really, these were police officers wanting more information to lock him up. The next day, Dene took two of the undercover officers, whom he believed again were his crime buddies, to the alleged crime scene, the supposed crime scene where he dumped Wendy's body. Then they proceeded to tell him that they needed to make sure that there was no evidence left behind that police would discover at the swamp. So Dene pointed to this tarp that was sticking out from the swamp, obviously saying that that was part of the crime scene. The very next day, the undercover officers went back to the swamp to pick up this piece of tarp. They sent it to an analyst. What do you think? Could he have made all this up? The part about the tooth and how we explained everything away, saying that, oh, she was inside the tarp, but then, after searching, detectives found nothing there. Granted, this area was full of wildlife, bears and wolves, so they're carnivores. You can do the math. It had also been 11 years, and that's what I meant by doing the math. That's a long time. I tend to think skeptically. I think if this is a first-time killer, is he that good at committing a crime that he can hide a body that well without anyone seeing him? Nobody would look. Wouldn't that be a typical place for someone to hide someone or something, in the brush? Wouldn't detectives have canvassed all of these areas? I don't know. It was an hour and a half away, but I feel like they would know Highway 16 and they had been searching up and down it. He said that after this, he then drove back to Prince George, getting rid of the gun and Wendy's ID along the way. And that's when he left the white Plymouth Voyager in the grocery store parking lot. He claimed that he had just wandered around for a bit before he called Anna and told her that Wendy had never come to get him. He explained that he intentionally chose to bring Anna back with him around town that night, to the coffee shop and to Tim Hortons, so that she would be the one to discover the van. Even if Danae was what he thought was 100% sure that this was the right location, I can't even remember something I did yesterday, let alone something that happened 11 years ago in all of that brush. Then I thought about the fact that he would have to have the tarp ready, like she's bending down with the ducks. A couple of days after the Mr. Big operation, Anna received a phone call from the police asking that she come downtown. They sat her down and informed her that they had arrested her father. Anna broke down when she heard the news. She felt like she had always known in her heart that this was what happened. When Gabriel was brought in, though, and he was told the same news, he reacted much differently than his sister. He didn't just believe that his father could have done this to his mother, and he was a little confused about the whole sting operation and how all that went down. It was, again, just skeptical. That's how he felt, and it made him confront his father. He demanded to know what happened. Danae looked at him and told him he did not do it, and Gabriel believed him. Then Gabriel told police that he was home and he never heard any gunshot that day, especially where his dad claimed that it happened. There was no way that he wouldn't have heard something. Gabriel wasn't the only person that had been skeptical. When Gabriel contacted Wendy's family that lived in the United States and told them, they didn't believe it for a minute, especially Wendy's sister, Karen. She said that her family had always seen Danae as someone who would have died to protect his family, and they could never imagine him doing anything to hurt any one of them. Danae's sister was also skeptical and believed that her brother was innocent. There was no physical evidence even around the area, and they had searched the outside of their home. They had done all the preliminary searches in that area. No body, no DNA, no physical evidence that any foul play had been involved. Even though they had searched the area that Danae had brought them to, the analyst came back with inconclusive evidence of the tarp, yet they still arrested him. Danae even told his sister he made up the story about what he did to Wendy because he just wanted the investigation into him to stop. If he didn't come up with something to tell Mr. Big, then they weren't going to be able to help him. He also told her that he lied during the undercover operation. He told these officers at one point that he killed a man with rat poison, even though it turned out this man died of natural causes. Gabriel and Danae's sister believed that Danae felt like he belonged somewhere for the very first time in a long time, and that he would have said anything, so that he wouldn't lose that. When asked what the reason was that he would kill Wendy, when he made this confession to Mr. Big, it made everyone confused. He said that on the day he killed her, he knew that her alter ego, Shauna, was about to do something sexually inappropriate to Anna, and that he couldn't let that happen. So he wanted to get rid of Shauna, and in order to get rid of Shauna, he had to get rid of his wife, Wendy. Although Dennis's supporters often use the Mr. Big sting to discredit the arrest, saying that, of course, he just told Mr. Big what he thought he wanted to hear. Danae actually confessed a second time, this time knowing that he was speaking to an actual officer. After Danae was arrested, his rights were read, then he was shown a video of him confessing undercover to Mr. Big. He did initially deny what he said that day. He said, "No, I didn't do it, I didn't kill her," and he denied it for almost an hour. Then police decided that they needed to show him a video that they'd recorded of Gabriel, where Gabriel had told them that he just wanted his father to tell the truth. I don't know about you, but some of these police tactics really bother me. You are pulling at this man's heartstrings. I don't know what happened. I don't know if he's guilty or not. But nonetheless, it's just interesting that they're allowed to use all these tactics. And I understand why they do it, because a lot of times it works. We catch the right person. He sat there for a few minutes after watching that video of his son, and that's when he started to repeat the same confession that he had given to Mr. Big. He told the officer, listen, she didn't suffer, and he told the officer that he had cried when he did it. But he did confirm everything that he said to Mr. Big in that hotel room. He said, it's all true. In December of 2010, the trial began for the murder of Wendy Rite. Anna had been the only member of the family that wasn't standing by her father. He pled not guilty and recanted both of his confessions. Danae's defense attorney's main argument had been that there was no physical evidence and that Danae had lied about all of the things he said to Mr. Big and the undercover detectives. So, why should his confession be taken as the truth? Gabriel had been only one of 2 witnesses that took the stand for the defense. After a 4-week trial, the jury only took 2 hours to find Danae Rite guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life. As Anna left the courtroom after her father's sentencing, her father turned to her and said, "Keep looking for your mother." She was offended by the statement. She just wanted him to admit everything. She felt it was very selfish for him to say that to her, especially after all the time that she had put into looking for her mother, from age 17 to 27, practically her entire life. Gabriel, on the other hand, is now a father himself to his own little girl, and he's allowed her to meet his father. But as of the Dateline interviews with the family, he had yet to let his sister Anna meet his daughter. Gabriel still believes that Wendy could be out there somewhere. As much as Anna is happy to finally have justice, she really does hope that she can have a relationship with her brother again. Even Wendy's family stood by Danae. They said that he was always there to protect her, and that in the United States, this outcome was not likely to ever happen. There was not enough evidence to prove he did anything except lie to the police because of their deceptive sting operation and his desperation to belong to something. He had nothing to lose. His children had totally different perspectives about their father, and this was apparent in their victim impact statements. Gabriel, who was 29 at the time, pleaded for leniency. However, Anna, through tears, said this: "He deserves to spend the rest of his life in a self-made hell." She went on to say he was self-centered and a lowlife who was full of deceit and clearly committed the act beyond a reasonable doubt. She said, "I cannot understand why murder was chosen over divorce." Anna said she lost everything: the ability for her mom to see her graduate from high school, to be at her wedding, or give her motherly advice throughout the rest of her life, and I can understand that. She told the court that she went from an idealistic free spirit who loved life with great passion and optimism to an emotionally crippled human being who has trust issues, health issues, and fear, and rightfully so. Even if her father was not responsible, it wouldn't change that. But she still referred to him as a two-faced liar, bringing up the fact that he had that secret gambling life with his scumbag buddies that he loved so much, that he stole money from his own family, from Anna, from her mother, from Gabriel. He took that money on the pretext of buying his wife an anniversary gift, only to spend it on gambling. He was just like his father. He stole money from his family, the way his own father did from his. It was just history repeating itself. She went on to explain that she still stuck up for him after he was caught selling hard drugs, and now she doesn't know how she could have been so blind. She said he's where he belongs, even if he didn't murder her mother. That's how much it seems like she hates her father. I honestly kept wondering if there was something more to what happened to her, something more to her childhood, why she harbored what seems like so much hatred toward him. Both children have changed their last names, probably to avoid the stigma that their father's last name brings. Gabriel was conflicted on what he believed. He doesn't want to lose his father because he already lost his mother, and until they find a body or can confirm that his father did this, he's not pushing him out of his life. Gabriel said, "He has been a great father to me before and after my mom disappeared, and this convinced him that he would not be a risk for reoffending." He went on to say that he had no idea his father recanted the allegation about being worried that Wendy's alter ego was hurting Anna. Once he was under oath, he said, "No, I just said that. That's not true." Gabriel didn't know that, and that made him believe even more that his father didn't do this. There was just an update about this case in September 2021. This is when Danae was denied day parole under Canadian law. It's a form of release where you can participate in public activities during the day, and then you have to return every night to either a prison or a halfway house. His behavior in prison was satisfactory, and he had been accepted into a halfway house in Lower Mainland before he got denied day parole. So that would have been great for him, but the court panel remained concerned. They said that after the murder, he was convicted and sentenced on that trafficking-related charge, and this indicated to them that his involvement in criminal activity was likely greater than what his record showed, and that he was entrenched in this criminal attitude. That's why he wanted to be part of the gang with Mr. Big. The panel said, "Your file states that you have little insider understanding into your actions. Further reports indicate you are very comfortable playing the victim role and blaming everyone but yourself. You have accepted little responsibility for your offending behavior by way of victim empathy." The panel went on to say that he had not participated in any programs or other interventions to challenge his problematic thinking patterns and behaviors that contributed to his offenses, specifically his drug-related offenses. Overall, the board remains highly concerned that he would be a violent offender with risk factors because he was unwilling or unable to challenge his persistent cognitive distortions related to his role in the crimes he committed and continued to point blame at others.